Maria, are we streaming?
Yes.
Okay.
Now we are.
Okay, great. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this October 5th, 2022 meeting of the North Carolina State Board of Education. I'm Eric Davis, Chair of the Board, and I call this meeting to order. I welcome all of my fellow board members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, online listeners, and Twitter followers. And please note that you can follow the State Board of Education on its Twitter page at edstateboard_NC. And you can follow the meeting online and see all the materials by going to SBE meetings at www.ncpublicschools.org. For our visitors and those listening online, today's agenda involves our board discussions on agenda items, and tomorrow's agenda is the official meeting when the board will vote on its action items. We're honored over the next couple days to have several of our local superintendents who will be joining us. Those include Brian Oliver from McDowell County, Dale Ellis from Montgomery County, Matthew Cheeseman from Beaufort County, and Ethan Linker from Pitt County. If you're one of our local superintendents with us today, could you please stand so we can thank you? We know that your time is really precious, and we appreciate you spending the next 2 days with you, and look forward to further conversations. Board members, you're reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record, and if during the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Board members, last week you received the agenda and have had the opportunity to review it. I ask if there are any requests for changes to the agenda. Hearing none, I request a motion to approve the October 5th and 6th agenda. Motion by Mr. Keenan, second by the treasurer. Dr. Petrie Martin.
Dr. Oxendine. Ms. Kamnitz.
Yes.
Mr. Keenan.
Yes.
Mr. Hull. Dr. Tipton Rogers.
Yes.
Ms. White.
Yes.
Mr. Blackburn.
Yes.
Mr. Ford. Treasurer Falwell.
Yes.
Lieutenant Governor Robinson. Vice Chairman Duncan.
Yes.
Chairman Davis.
Yes, motion carries. We have an agenda. Thank you. We'll now proceed to the student learning and achievement discussions led by Ms. Jill Kamnitz. Ms. Kamnitz.
Thank you, Chair Davis. We start off this morning with 3 items of new business. The first one is the North Carolina Personalized Assessment Tool. Work on this has been going on quietly since 2019 in our Testing and Accountability Division, and this morning Dr. Howard is going to share some really good news, and we're going to get to hear from a teacher who's been using our new tool, or our tool that's in development. So, Dr. Howard.
Absolutely, and thank you and good morning. So just as a reminder, the innovative assessment tool that we are piloting in North Carolina, we were given the authority to do that by the U.S. Department of Education in June of 2019. And our solution consists of 2 parts. One is the NC Check-ins 2.0, and the other part is a flexible summative assessment. The U.S. Department of Education does require that we annually report to them on the progress with the pilot. The most recent report was submitted to them on September 30th, and it is attached to this board item for your review or consideration. Likewise, the North Carolina General Assembly by November 15th also requires that we submit a report to them. So that report will be delivered to the General Assembly as scheduled, and it will include the U.S. Department of Education report as part of its contents. So to look at the NC PAT a little bit more detailed, considering first the NC check-ins. There are 3 NC check-ins that are administered in a school year. They're available through the entire school year within a very broad window of early fall to late spring, so they do not have the specific testing windows that we usually associate with our tests that we administer. They are intended to provide feedback for classroom instruction. That is the priority, that is the emphasis on their use. They are not intended to be used for accountability or comparison purposes of ranking schools. They're intended to be given as input. They're also designed to be administered online, and we're having much success with that. And this is a little bit different than we've ever done in the past, because if you think about it, in the past we have developed assessments for paper pencil, and then we transitioned them to online. This is a big shift that we're developing this to be administered online, with then making accommodations for those who we know will always require paper pencil. And then the second part is the flexible summative. So the primary question is, well, how does the flexible summative relate to those NC Check-ins 2.0? Well, first of all, those NC Check-ins 2.0 students, once this goes statewide, would not have to have any NC Check-ins 2.0 participation to participate in that flexible summative. And that is necessary and key to this design, because we know we're a transitory state, and we know we have students that sometimes show up on the first day of the testing window. So we have to be able to accommodate all students, whether they have participated in NC Check-ins 2.0 or not. Also, NC Check-ins 2.0 are voluntary at this point, and we would intend to keep it that way. So it is a local decision as to whether or not to use those instruments throughout the school year. It is required, in order to direct a student to the flexible summative, if we are using NC Check-ins 2.0, that a student must have 2. They don't have to have all 3. But the psychometricians have reviewed this, and they have determined data from 2 will give them sufficient information to then route a student to the flexible summative that is most appropriate to their performance, as has been demonstrated on the NC Check-ins 2.0. And that leads us to the hard question, so how are they related? So very clear, the academic achievement level, which is not proficient, level 3, level 4, level 5, that comes solely from that end of year assessment. And we feel really committed to doing that at this point, because we know that students, what they know in November is not necessarily what they know in May or June. And we want to make sure we give all students that final opportunity to show everything that they know at the end of the year, and to not capture it in November and roll it up for the end of the year. We want to give them that full opportunity. In thinking about the design and the fact that not all students get the same form of that flexible summative, if you will, if you think about it, we've always done that. We've always had multiple forms of our test, A, B, C, and they have different colors, red, purple, green. And, the common myth has been that the red form or the purple form is the harder form. But the work of our psychometricians is that does not occur. That cannot occur, because if that occurs, then we're not holding students to the same expectation. And that is actually in federal law that we have to do that. So in this design, it's the psychometric properties and the design. So regardless of which targeted set of items that students get based on their performance on NC Check-ins 2.0, they will have the ability to demonstrate across the continuum of the academic achievement levels, which is not proficient, level 3, level 4, level 5. So a student could do well on NC Check-ins 2.0 and then not do well on the flexible summative, theoretically, and the reverse could happen as well. We're having lots of conversations with our colleagues across the state. We had one yesterday. We had a meeting here in Raleigh with our testing coordinators and accountability directors, and we spent some time talking through this with them. We realized the importance of understanding that. We've drafted a parent letter that we have already shared with our pilot schools this year, that they can share with their parents so the parents understand what is happening. But we recognize that is a conversation that is ongoing, and we need to continue working on communicating that aspect of this. So looking at the timeline, you will see here that the goal is potentially, because we have little asterisks, to go statewide in 2023-24. We are very optimistic that possibly we could go statewide with grades 4 and 7. That's a decision down the road. But what we could do is potentially do 4 and 7 statewide in 2023-24, and then roll in the other grades the next year. And of course, all of this is dependent upon having solid data analysis to back up those decisions, and that's why we have those asterisks. As I mentioned already, getting input from our testing and accountability directors across the state, you can see here there was a huge effort to make sure that we have all kinds of exposure to advisories and councils, to parents, to students, other members of our public school units. This is a collaborative effort. We have to have that input, and I will absolutely say that already the input has made a direct impact on some of the decisions and some of the design that we have done with this program, and would not be possible because we're not the end users. And as we all know, the end users are the ones sometimes who can say, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't quite work. We need this. So also, pilot volunteers for this school year, very excited. We're back pretty much to where we were pre-COVID. We understood we had a dip with COVID, absolutely, but we are very much back. And of course, the pilots have to mirror the demographics of the state, the representatives of the state, and we are able to do that. We have to provide that information to the U.S. Department of Education. All of the work that we do in test development, that is always a primary concern, that we are being representative of all of our student populations. We also did some surveys about the understanding the reports that are generated from NC Check-ins 2.0. And in your board materials, there is an attached report from the Friday Institute with that information that I would suggest that you review at your leisure. But part of looking at that report and knowing that last year we spent time not only surveying our participants in the pilot, but also we went out and did some monitoring. And monitoring is too strong of a word. We went out and did some observations because we wanted to see firsthand how this worked in the classroom. And we were very fortunate to go to Hazelwood Elementary and Haywood County. And in that experience, we encountered Shannon Reese, who is a fourth grade teacher, and she very graciously and kindly agreed to come all the way from Haywood County to join us this morning and give her perspective. And she is joined this morning by Ann Trader, who is the lead teacher and testing coordinator at Hazelwood Elementary as well. So if you'll just stand briefly away. That would be great. So good morning, and thank you as well. So we know it's a long journey to Haywood County, but we really appreciate them coming. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Reese at this time, and she's going to share information with you.
Good morning. I'm honored to be here today. So I was asked to come and talk to you about how we use the data from the NC interims last year to drive our instruction. First of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of interim testing. I think there are lots of benefits to doing these interims for the students, for the teachers, and for schools and districts. As a teacher and talking with other teachers, we are very pleased that the interims are shorter and more focused tests on fewer standards. We just feel like that's more accurate picture of a student's mastery and not a more of a accurate picture of their stamina, like the EOG can be. And we feel like just the fact that we get more data throughout the year helps us drive the instruction that year instead of waiting a full academic year to get data that then those students are already gone from us and in a different grade level and working on different standards at that point. So we feel like it does definitely benefit the students. It's a more comfortable atmosphere. Everyone's in our classroom with the people they're used to being with, just in the environment that is most comfortable for them. And we often would refer to the interims last year as like a 5K compared to a marathon, because, like I said, it is fewer standards that they're being questioned on at one time. And it's just one of the greatest benefits I thought for students was just that as we get that data back throughout the year, they were able themselves to kind of set more learning goals and for themselves throughout the year. So that was very beneficial. And for teachers, the process of giving it is similar to the EOG, so there wasn't any major new training that we had to do, or we didn't feel like we had to prepare our students for a whole different kind of test. It's the same kind of format on the computer, those kinds of things. So we appreciated that. Less stressful atmosphere for us also. But we felt like it held students to a high standard, and it also still held teachers accountable for covering all the content that we're supposed to cover. And just giving us that regular data throughout the year, and very objective data, and getting those data sheets back and being able to really aggregate that data and use that throughout the year. And to help us provide more meaningful instruction. And for schools and districts, just the ability that we could choose as a district what order we wanted to take those interims in was a big deal for us, because there's not a statewide pacing guide. And so each school district has their own pacing guide. And so we were able, none of them are going to fit perfectly with any one district's pacing guides, but we were able to pick and choose how we wanted to give those to best fit to our pacing guide. So that was important for us. And then also for districts, it just kind of gives them the ability to be able to plan staff development, not for a year or two down the road, but to be able to do that in the middle of the school year. So that was important. So then we just kind of get to where, okay, the students have tested, and now what are we going to do? So we first always have to be asking ourselves, what does mastery look like in core instruction? And when we have that data come in and we're still in the middle of the school year, and we can look through that data and we can see, are there trends? Are there flukes? Because, trends are going to indicate to us whether or not we need to adjust our methodology and what we're doing in the classroom. But we also were able to look at that data and, see were there test results that surprised us, and think back on that day. Was there a student that was sleepy, or a student that fell asleep actually during the test? Did a kid forget their glasses and they couldn't see very well? Did a child not have their medicine that they normally take in the morning for ADHD or something like that, and did they not have it that morning? Could that have affected their test result? Or were they not feeling well? So those are all important things that we were able to, look through the data and kind of pinpoint where we saw things that surprised us. And also just looking at the data through the lens of domains and standards, because, some people would just say, we had to test on fractions and we hadn't even covered that yet. But that's still important data for us as teachers, because they don't align perfectly to that pacing guide that we use, but you're able to look at that data and say, I haven't taught fractions, or I haven't taught inferencing, but look how well my kids did on this particular standard. So they kind of already have some mastery of that. I may not need to spend as much whole group instructional time on that standard during the school year. It may be something I could just pull a small group for, or something like that. Or you may look at something else and say, they have no idea about that, and so I'm going to really need to spend a good bit of instructional time on that. So once we analyze that data for those kinds of things, then we get together at our school and we collaborate as a team. And this is where you ask the hard questions, and honestly, sometimes it's the questions that can humble you because, we get together and we're like, was there a domain or a standard for which one class outperformed another class? And what did that teacher do that was more effective? And how can we adjust our methodology and get our students across the grade level to that level of performance? And so we look at everything in our PLCs. We go through domains and standards. And we also looked at the depth of knowledge of questions, because I think we kind of used to have a mindset of, oh, wow, look at this question. Like 3/4 of my class missed this. I've got to use whole group time instruction and really reteach this. But getting those data sheets from the interims, you can look and you can see, okay, if this was a depth of knowledge 1 or a depth of knowledge 2 question, then yes, this may need to be something that you spend whole group instructional time going back over. But if this was like a depth of knowledge 3 question, for example, in 4th grade where children are having to determine the area of a rectilinear shape, that might be a question that only your higher flyers in your class are even going to be able to activate that higher standard of knowledge to even be able to work on. So that might, again, not be something you want to waste time doing a whole group. You want to just pull your higher flyers for a small group and cover that. So that was important to us. And so then we just kind of discuss and determine our approaches as we move forward, and then we adjust and act on it. We have a group of 80 plus students in our fourth grade this year, and there's going to be a diverse set of needs. So we kind of look at it and we decide who needs remediation, who just needs some practice and repetition, and who needs some test-taking strategies, and then who needs to be enriched, and who's, got this and just really needs to be challenged some. So we kind of group kids according to their needs and go from there. And there are lots of questions that we had to discuss, like what are appropriate group sizes for this? How are we going to fit this into our academic day with everything else that we need to do, and who will teach what? But like I said, these were the conversations that could humble some people, but it's something that if you really use this data from the interims and you have that available to you throughout the year, you really can adjust throughout the year, and you don't feel like you're just kicking the can down the road to the next school year. We have a system that we use at Hazelwood, and I've got a picture in the slideshow of a poster that we have hanging up in our PLC room, where we have support groups, focus groups, strategy groups, and challenge groups. And so when we're in those PLCs and we're going through this data, we're trying to decide, and they're flexible groups, so children can move from group to group depending on what we're doing. But we've got to have those different groups. And again, we're asking ourselves, what does mastery look like in core instruction for this standard? And we're referring to the unpacking documents and things to look at that. And so we have support groups, and these are kids that would need like Tier 3 intensive interventions. And then we've got focus groups where these are students that need some Tier 2 targeted support and some explicit instruction. And then we've got strategy groups where they need some practice and they need some repetition, and we need to just help them with some test-taking skills and maybe work on stamina. And then our challenge group, those are the kids that need the enrichment and practice with more of the depth of knowledge 3 type questions that you would see on the test. So just in closing, we were very pleased to be a part of this pilot program. We felt like it gave us a great opportunity to see where the state of North Carolina is going in testing, and just like I've said multiple times, just having that data throughout the year and being able to adjust our methodology and what we need to do throughout the year to be able to meet the needs of our students as quickly as possible is just so very helpful to us, instead of just having EOG data from one year to the next. So I appreciate you letting me be here this morning. I appreciate you listening, and it was very nice to be here. Thank you.
Ms. Reese, don't go away.
Yes.
Thank you, first of all, for coming all that way.
Oh,
But
well,
I'll tell you,
we're both NC State grads, so we were happy to come back.
When we hear from teachers about translating what we're hearing on the policy level to the classroom level, it's always helpful to us. But I'm speaking for myself, this really makes me excited about this work. Just listening to you talk about how it's impacted your classroom and the students at Hazelwood. I know there's going to be questions. We're talking about a big change in
Yes.
across the state in our testing accountability. This is huge. So, Superintendent Short, start us off.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mrs. Kamitz. Thank you very much again for coming all this way and for sharing your expertise with us. I want to make a comment, and then I'm going to ask a question. So I think that everything that you've presented to us in terms of the day-to-day of how participating in this pilot has provided a solution to ongoing problems with end-of-grade, high-stakes, one-and-done testing. Everything that you've shared with us underscores the need to change our testing and accountability model. Now, the challenge before us is that because of federal requirements, as we continue with our advisory group led by Dr. Marr, as we continue to work on that new set of recommendations to go to the legislature, we will still be required by the U.S. Department of Education, as we should, to include achievement scores from testing as well as growth as part of that model. We just don't want it to be weighted at 80%, and we don't want those two measurements to be the only things that are considered. But without this pilot, we still wouldn't have a solution to the issue of all of the things that you just shared with us. A child doesn't have his glasses that day. A child is sick that day and still takes the test and doesn't do well. Not to mention the fact that your presentation shows that the point of testing is to inform teachers, parents, and the child, which high stakes end of grade, one day, one and done testing doesn't do. So you've given us a solution to a problem that we're still going to have even after we reform our testing and accountability model. And so for that, I thank you. I guess my question is just what, as you mentioned, change is hard. What kind of pushback did you see, if any, from your colleagues?
I mean, there are always going to be colleagues who feel like we're just tested to death, and that there's just more of that than there is actual time to teach. But I really felt like once we got in and we dug into this data and we bought into the fact that it's not just me, we're a team, and all 80 of these kids are our kids. And when we bought into that and we used that to drive our future instruction, everybody was in. Everybody was in. So, and I think that there are probably other places that wish they had done the pilot that didn't do it in the beginning.
Thank you so much again.
Yes, you're welcome.
Ms. White?
So I'm already thinking forward. Something that you presented about with the data that you received from these check-ins suggested that once you get that data, you have to focus on helping the students master the standards where there were gaps. At the same time, I know as a classroom teacher, you're looking forward to the things that you have to begin teaching for the next
Yes.
couple of weeks or months.
Yes.
So that time constraint is an issue. I'm thinking back about COVID and the enormous amount of time that was spent developing resources and modules aligned to the standards. And wouldn't it be so cool if we could automatically generate a list of those online resources for those standards, so that when a student missed 1.2 and 1.4 and 2.7, there's no way as a classroom teacher that you can go back and meet every gap for every student. But we have the online resources to provide that it would be a direct connect for teachers across our state. Because as you said, the real truth of it is some teachers teach some standards well, and others go, oh my goodness, look what you did. Could I borrow this practice? Could I borrow this idea? We would already have that if we have best standards and best practices in place online, so that every teacher across our state doesn't have to scramble to say, oh my goodness, my students missed this, and I don't really have time to go back and meet every student where they are.
Yes.
But we now have the resources to do that. I don't know where that connect is, but it seems like we could just automatically tie where the gaps are to the resources that we have available. Does that make sense?
It does. Would you like to respond, or?
Well, just like when we have the NC tools for teaching, we refer to those all the time. Our county uses math investigations as our standard for what we teach math by, but we pull constantly from the North Carolina Tools for Teachers because, first of all, it's put out by the state. The state's going to give you your test at the end of the year. Why would you not use the things that they're giving you to use? So when we have those kinds of resources that are easy to pull from and that the whole state can use, it does make life easier when you don't feel like you're having to reinvent the wheel every time you go to teach a standard. And it just, and it lays it out to the standard that the state is going to expect you to have your kids at mastery level for. So I would definitely love to see that for reading and math.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for coming. I love Haywood County
Oh.
so much. I want to know how similar were the questions on the interim assessments to the EOG itself?
We talked about that afterwards, and we felt like they were very much in line with what we had seen on EOGs before. And then when we got last year's EOG, with the exception of geometry standards, I'll be honest, we felt like they were very much in line with what we would be expecting to see on an EOG.
As an EOC teacher, the EOG or the EOC always felt like a big mystery to me until I served on the committee that actually wrote it. So it was this huge mystery. We had no idea. We knew what the standards were, but we didn't know what the format would be or what the questions would look like for years. It was, what does the purple form look like and the blue? And I remember everyone thought the purple was the bad one.
Yes, the purple was the bad one. Everybody would say that.
But it's like it's true. This to me just is amazing to know what the test could look like, and to give students that opportunity to prep for the test with something that looks like the test multiple times. I know my district creates like their own interim assessments, but they don't talk to the people who wrote the test, the state test, and so it looks nothing like it. When when they're practicing, the EOG EOC day will not be as stressful because it's old hat, like they know how to do it. And so I'm here for this. This is magical. Also, testament to your administrators, your curriculum coaches, etc., for making your PLCs a priority in your school building, and for teaching you guys, or for you guys leading, how to do it the right way. Everyone took ownership in that PLC. That is not something that's across the board in the state of North Carolina, and it really needs to be, because your PLC is magic.
Oh, thank you.
That is magic. I can tell you guys are besties, and you're doing the job. That's what we need in North Carolina. And so thank you so much for that work and for setting that example for what that should look like. When we get our data, that's what it looks like. That's what we're doing with it. And it's not just a number, it's an action.
Yes.
It's things that we're going to do now.
Yes.
It's amazing. So.
Yes, and that's what was so great about those data sheets. And when I did that interview with the gentleman where we talked about what we liked about the data sheet or what could be improved from the data sheet, when we just get the EOG scores at the end of the year, there's no data with it. But with this, we could look at a math question and we could see, did they just totally not get this and they just randomly guessed? Or did a lot of students in the class, was this a two-step problem and they all chose the answer to the first step and just didn't, make it all the way through the question? So we could see those kinds of things and we could talk to kids and say, look, you knew what you were doing and you were on the right track. But when you got that first step answer and you saw that answer over there on B, you said, oh, I'm done. And you clicked that and didn't think the rest of the way through the problem. So these are also good for just giving kids test-taking strategies
This
like
is
that.
magic. We're demystifying the EOG EOC, right? Like we're demystifying it and we're turning it into an opportunity for teachers to be better data and analysts, etc. Yay, team! We can all go home now. Job is done.
Dr. Oxendine, just very quickly. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I believe that if I'm correct in my timeline of things that have happened since I've been on state board many years ago, I believe, Dr. Howard, correct me if I'm wrong, seems like we're using the term interim, but are we talking still about check-ins? Well,
Yes.
you know what, that makes me even happier because I have heard so many good things about check-ins over the years. I mean, it's a consistent, positive story. And this goes back to 2015, when a task force was formed within the State Board of Education Committee group to study testing in North Carolina. The reason, one of the underlying, not just overarching reasons for the task force is because the public was kind of sick of all the testing that kids were exposed to. So our job was to kind of think through this and try to eliminate some of the tests. And so out of this came the idea of check-ins. We called them formatives for a while and reached the conclusion that it's really a check-in.
So, my question is this: do you, in your school community, get pushback from parents in the community about too much testing because of the interim?
Well, actually, we kind of, I won't necessarily say play them down, but we just don't make a big deal of them before we have them. I mean, we do send out a letter at the beginning of the year that kind of gives a testing schedule for the year, but we just don't make a huge deal of it. And oh, you got to make sure you're in bed at 8 o'clock. Oh, you got to make sure you eat a good breakfast. You got to make sure you're in comfortable clothes. We just don't. Because it just doesn't feel as high stakes to us, so we don't try to make it feel that high stakes to the kids. And I think they just perform better when they don't feel the stress of that.
Absolutely. So it's now in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
That's very good. And maybe that's another benefit, an offshoot of the check-ins.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes part of the culture. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we could probably talk, Ms. Floyd, I've got you, but then we're gonna need to move on unless, all right, Mr. Duncan. Then we're gonna move on, because I'm always the one who causes us to be late. Yeah.
I'll promise I'll be quick, but I could not talk to my fellow fourth grade teacher at this podium right now. So thank you so much for everything you shared. I really love one thing that you kept saying was that you talked about what does the mastery look like in the core instruction. And so when I think about the check-ins themselves, and I did them too, right? Like I think about what kind of knowledge did you all maybe get from, I know you talked about like within your PLC, a person might have had a more success in a standard and their instruction. I guess my question is, did you find any like trends around even like the curriculum that maybe the district has decided to use that is not stressing certain standards, and you had to kind of regroup it, you know what I'm trying to say, right?
Well,
there's that.
Without saying too much negative things about math investigations, we have learned over the years that we have to supplement. There's just really not a canned math program out there that is going to meet the needs for every standard in a grade level. There's just not. We love the order that math investigations is taught in. We love a lot of the ways that they present the data, and the curriculum, and have children thinking through why things work the way they work, and not just a procedural method to get to an answer. But there is still a lot of things where we have to pull and supplement to get to that. So, and these help us once again see where those gaps are, or what maybe vocabulary we're not using. Because you can call something a central idea or a central message, or and when you see that throughout the year on a test, you can go to using that vocabulary so that you're certain your kids recognize that when it comes to the EOG test.
So thank you so much for
Yes.
that. I just think that this is, although, I love that we mentioned that this is such a great instructional tool for our kids, and it's great for teachers, but it's also great for our districts, our superintendents to also, in our curriculum folks, to really be thinking about like where can we lean in, and what things need to be pulled out, and what should we add to the NC toolkits and things that could be supplemental for what you just talked about that would be helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very thoughtful, and the work that you're doing is most appreciated, and I'm sure most of all by your students and their parents. Your presentation has framed a question that's sort of floated in my mind, and I think maybe you'll help me frame it better. And it's a policy question. I'm interested in your thoughts, given the work that you've been doing. I was a K through 12 child, primarily of the 1960s, a long time ago. And at that time, in both Virginia and Massachusetts, where I went to school, tracking was utilized heavily for students. And that fell into disfavor in periods after that time. So you went away from tracking. And the formulation of the ideal classroom was a teacher who would be able to reach all levels of a student within the same classroom. Some of the data or studies on that suggest that there are some incredibly talented teachers who are able to do that, but there are a lot of talented teachers who are not able to have that particular skill. So that methodology can be outstanding. It can also be difficult. One of the things I've seen that we've moved to is have in elementary school looking at scores, our best reading teacher take all the students in the third grade for reading in rotating classrooms, and math, all the students for that. Then in science, all the students for that, which is not a tracking, but it's a focus on skills of your educators. What you've described a little bit reminded me of the old tracking system in some ways, and I'm wondering where we are or what your thoughts are about where we are in terms of.
Well, in
What-
our
what is the
district
best
and in our
approach?
school, we don't do like team teaching where like I'm the math teacher and somebody else is teaching
Right.
the reading. But what our administration at my school does give us the ability to do is when we group those kids into small groups, like I can honestly stand here and say it's harder for me to grow my challenge kids that need the enrichment. That's the hardest group for me to grow, and I know that. I do better with those middle of the road and slightly below grade level kids. Those are the ones that I can grow the best, and I know that from looking at data over the years. But our administration gives us the ability to group those kids and then work together as a team. And it's not me pulling all those groups from my classroom. It's all of it's all of the teachers in our grade level, and we can shift around and move groups from room to room. And so if there's a teacher that's stronger with enrichment, or a teacher that's stronger with, really working with those low babies that have IEPs, and we need to, really work with them. If that teacher's stronger with that, then they work with those students. So it doesn't necessarily feel like kids are getting tracked into and they're going down this trail and they have no chance of, like we're just on track to be, this is what they think we are. It gives us the opportunity for just the students to get it from a different teacher at different times. So that's the way we're approaching things. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so
Good.
much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Howard, to the hard work that has gone to get us to this point.
Yes.
All the credit goes to teachers like this, Reese, absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Congratulations to you and your school.
Oh, thank you.
You are helping us learn and make this better, and we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Our second item of new business is our very familiar K-12 Science and Healthful Living Standards update. Dr. Day is going to, we've sort of got the drill now, so she's going to just give us a quick update about where we are on both.
Yes, good morning. This will be very brief as we come every month for an update on the K-12 Science and Healthful Living Standards revision. Just a reminder, State Board Policy SCOS 012. That is the policy that guides our process. And then the next slide links to our internal procedures manual, which details our approach and how we work through the review, revision, and implementation. A reminder that we are in a hybrid process for Science and Healthful Living. We are doing about 28 to 24 months of work in about 12 to 14. So when you look at the manual, no, we're doing all the steps. We're just doing it quicker than what's in the manual. So updates for science. Completed actions. The DRC held their orientation and work session in early September. It was very successful. We had a wonderful group of educators from across the state to do that work. They are completing, almost finished, with their initial data review and recommendations. That report will go to the writers. The writing team is finalized and will meet in mid-October to begin their work and their orientation. Also in October, when that standards writing team comes together, we will also have a team of extended content standard writers. So the EC, we've been working with the Office of Exceptional Children so that they will come with us and work together to create both sets of standards at the same time. Typically in the past, the extended content standards usually come to you about a year after, and we feel it's best to work together as a whole group to make sure all students are supported and those standards meet the needs of all students. SWT will use those recommendations, the research, to begin revising the standards, and we hope tentatively to release a first draft in early November, and that will be out for 30 days for public feedback as well as PSU specific feedback. For Healthful Living, we have reopened. We had our 6-month delay, up to 6-month delay. So we reopened all the applications, all the surveys, have been in communication with PSU leaders. And the next slide shows you an update of where we are with those PSU numbers. So as of the 28th, which actually we are at 87, so 87 out of the 115 LEAs have responded. So back a few months ago when we came to you all to ask for that delay, we were about 30 to 35% of PSUs, and we are currently at 75%. We had held a threshold of around 80. We feel comfortable with 75% and moving forward. We've exhausted all the communication lanes that we can. So we lean to the board for guidance on the movement forward with the healthful living standards. The chart shows by region the number of responses out of that 87 and the percentage of the region that responded. So we will lean to your guidance on moving forward. If we get the green light to move forward, we will give a 2-week window, and we'll give notice to all PSUs, all stakeholders, that we will close the applications for DRC and SWT, as well as all stakeholder and the PSU survey in 2 weeks, and then we will move forward with our next steps.
So, I thought that was, but we don't need to pause here. So Chris, Dr. Day needs some guidance. Is there anyone who has concerns about ending this process at 75% and then moving forward with the work? Is there any concerns about that? Vice Chair?
I have concerns that we can't get all our PSUs to respond to this.
Yes.
And the depth even within the 75% may not be as deeply into the roots as we want to be. And a lot of the studies for this suggest that you do need the fact that data you can generate from this is incredibly helpful in many different ways. And I do worry about the level of depth of the information that we're going to receive. And I'm disappointed that we find ourselves in this place. And I think the board is. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we are disappointed we don't have deeper, richer data available, because this is to help students. This is for the benefit of students. That's why Dr. Day and her staff are working so hard and trying to gather this data. And I just think we'd be remiss not to say how disappointed we are that we're not at a place where we're not better situated to use the best possible data available.
Agreed, and a lot of effort got us to the 75%, so yes, I agree. But again, at this point, I think we're hearing from Dr. Day that she feels like they've exhausted all the possibilities, so ready to move on.
And I'm not sure if this gives comfort to anyone on the board or not, but I did ask Dr. Day if she has a written record of the efforts that we have undergone to get from the 35% to the 75%, and we do.
I feel very much, I feel better about the decision that you've asked us to make today about stopping at this point at the 75%, mainly because you have added the regional data to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important. I wasn't leaning so much in favor of, I wanted to press on a bit more, but now that I see the regional data looks pretty convincing.
Mm.
All right, if there are no other comments, yes.
Dr. Day, besides just the percentage of responses, when you look at the responses, are there any areas of concern where we're receiving limited input, such that if we move forward, we might have risk? And if so, should we maybe do some targeted surveying in any areas where our responses are thin?
I'm going to turn to Dr. Essick on that. She's more into the data on that than I am.
Good morning. The limited data is across the board. I don't think there's one area that specifically needs more information than others. I think people responded more in some areas than others, and a lot of those responses were opinions in general. They weren't specific to the questions that were being asked, so we didn't get a lot of really specific data saying, yes, get rid of this standard, or no, keep this standard. A lot of that data was more broad and general about what we should or shouldn't be teaching in public schools, and that's not specific to the surveys, to the current standards that we have, which is the questions were about the current standards and what folks thought they should change or keep the same. I think generally we have most people said they wanted to keep most of our standards the same as they are now in the data that we have so far. I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
No, you did. In fact, that gives me greater insight than just looking at a number on the screen, that the responses we got are fairly thin. But the,
Yes.
the sort of the weight of the responses is towards keeping what we have with some variability in there.
Right, we'll
I
have to
think
look
you-
at current
I think
data.
you answered the question and gave us even greater insight into the risk. But personally, I appreciate the efforts, and I can also appreciate why some chose not to respond, given the climate we live in. It does give me concern about how we move forward, just given the lack of detailed responses that we have.
Well, fortunately, we have a data review committee. We have a separate committee that is dedicated to research and data, to add to the feedback that we got from the districts. And that committee is separate from the standards writing team. The DRC is the data review committee.
I say, so that, if I can continue. So, thank you, Superintendent. So that sounds like now we've got another effort about to kick in, and the question before us is, do we delay kicking in that other effort? And my personal opinion is no, we ought to press on. We might then need to come back and ask some additional questions, but that really helps, so thank you.
There is another opportunity in the process for the PSUs to give us feedback again.
Yes,
After
yes.
the first draft is out there,
Yes.
so
Okay.
it's
Right.
not the end
Public
of
comment
that
period.
opportunity.
Right, the DRC will create a report based on data and research. Other state standards have recently revised, and that report will be compiled before the writers begin their work.
Thank you so much, Ms. Our final item of new business is multilingual learners update. I think this is Ms. Daniel.
Hi, good morning, Chairman Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, and members of the board. I'm Stacy Daniel, and I serve as the ELA and Languages Section Chief, and I'm really honored to be here today to talk about the work that the ML Title III team has done to date. As context, the state board adopted the 2020 WIDA standards framework as the North Carolina English Language Development Standard Course of Study in March of 2021 for implementation this 22-23 school year. As you can see from our team's vision, the ML Title III team's work is extensive. It covers English learner identification, data collection, reporting, program quality, and of course, program compliance. But today we bring forth the work that this team has done in terms of sustaining statewide implementation of the ELD standards through their professional learning and resources that they've developed and provided to the PSUs so far. But before we highlight this work, we really just want to take a moment to bring your attention to the shift in language that you may have already seen from our team name as well as our team vision. In March of this past year, our agency has began the shift from using the term English learners, or EL, to multilingual learners, or ML. And we've actually followed suit with WIDA, other national organizations, other state education agencies, and we really feel as if this asset-based term really recognizes the linguistic strengths of our students who speak and are developing proficiency in multiple languages. We recognize that in K-12 education, there are various terms that are used to refer to multilingual learners. So for policy and legislation purposes, we will maintain the term English learner, and for all other purposes, we'll be using the term multilingual learner. And you'll see both of these terms throughout the presentation today. We have encouraged PSUs to use this term at the local level as well, and we also know that there may be some confusion about how and when to use these particular terms. So our team has done quite a bit of marketing to help PSUs in this shift with language, as well as internal stakeholders at the agency. In terms of this asset-based shift, we really feel like it's an inclusive term. It celebrates our students and the diversity in North Carolina. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ivana Manthor-Anderson, who is a multilingual learner Title III consultant, who will share more statistics about this diversity in North Carolina public schools, as well as how this asset-based approach is present in the resources and the professional learning we've provided to PSUs.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel, and good morning to you on the State Board and to Superintendent Truitt. With over 300 diverse languages in North Carolina, tools in order to understand second language acquisition, as well as how to meet the needs of our educators and our multilingual students, are needed more now than ever. As you can see on the graph, our multilingual learner group has grown continuously for over 20 years and now consists of 8% of our total population in North Carolina. So with the data that was provided to us by the Office of Learning Recovery, we are excited to see that the work of our multilingual educators is working. We're doing something right. We have found that in the 2021 school year, on average, our multilingual students were less negatively impacted than the general student population, especially in reading grade 8, English 2, and Math 3, where their actual scores were above their expected scores, resulting in a positive growth effect. We attribute this to the passion and the expertise of our multilingual learner educators who provide systematic and sustained language development to our multilingual learners so they can access grade-level standards-based instruction. Guiding this standards-based instruction is the ELD Standard Course of Study. So as you can see on the next slide, the theoretical underpinning of the ELD Standards Framework are the 4 big ideas: equity of opportunity and access, integration of content and language, collaboration among stakeholders, and the functional approach to language development. These 4 ideas support our educational experiences so they are student-centered, linguistically relevant, and are responsive to multilingual learners' strengths and needs. And they have inspired us to work even more closely with our content area colleagues as we work with the ELD standards. So on the next slide, we have a quick overview of the ELD Standards Framework, which includes the 5 ELD standards. Standard 1, the language for social and instructional purposes, stands alone and also is integrated throughout the other 4 content standards. Standard 2, the language of language arts. Standard 3, the language of mathematics. Standard 4, the language of science. And Standard 5, the language of social studies. In the graph below, you can see the actual building blocks of the ELD Standards Framework, which begins with these standards, which are rather general, and then becomes more and more specific as it scaffolds our language learning. The ELD standards are state standards, and that's something we want to make sure all educators understand, that these standards are applicable to all teachers of multilingual learners, and they can be integrated into the content standards. So our goal is to help them see that this is not an additional responsibility, but a tool to help support meeting the needs of multilingual learners. So on the next slide, we move from theory into application as we created a number of resources to support the ELD standards. Things like the glossary, which give the terminology and also the acronyms that are related to ELD and English as a second language. Our crosswalk, which shows the transition from the 2012 standards to the current 2020 version of the standards. The unpacking document is very powerful for our content teachers and our EL teachers alike, as it gives specific classroom ideas and helps to give English language objectives that can be integrated into the content. The mapping document shows the connections between the content standards and the ELD standards, which helps with integration, co-planning, and also co-teaching. And then the parent caregiver guide allows for ML education to continue in a supported way outside of the classroom. You'll see a number of asterisks on the slide. Those asterisks show where we worked in collaboration with the ELD support team, which is a cadre of teachers and trainers and coaches around the state. So these resources are all housed in the ELD Standards Hub. And this hub is continually growing, and the work that we do here in North Carolina has been noticed by the WIDA Consortium. So we've provided a number of professional development opportunities as well as resources. Our monthly updates have allowed the field to stay up to date with our progress in both installation and implementation of the standards. There are a number of tools that the WIDA Consortium has provided for us, and then we like to take them in North Carolina-ize them through things like the coffee chats, where we bring those closer to what is happening in our context. And finally, the collaboration that we started early on with with arts education, which created webinars and also tools for the arts educators to successfully integrate the ELD standards.
So to empower all of our educators, the standards resources have been shared with a variety of stakeholders. We began with our EL coordinators. The EL coordinators are the spearhead for getting these standards out into the PSUs. Then we moved into our PSU implementation, which took place in a team approach, working with parents, working with educators, both in the ESL classroom and the content classroom, as well as working with our administrators, again, showing and modeling that the ELD standards are the responsibilities of all educators of multilingual learners. We then expanded our professional learning into our summer conference, taking the standards training directly to our classroom teachers. And finally, within NCDPI, we want to model the model of what we hope is happening in our PSUs by collaborating across content areas and across divisions as we share the ELD standards internally here at DPI. So as an extension of the standards work, there was development of a proposal for a competitive grant for state assessment. And we were very excited on September 26th to receive notification from the federal government, Department of Education, that North Carolina was granted this award. So we are very excited to be partnering with the Center for Applied Linguistics as we work to improve teaching and learning and support rigorous standards for our multilingual learners through the development of what we are calling the Multilingual Multimodal Science Inventory. So again, we are very excited to move into this opportunity to work with monolingual science classrooms as well as dual language immersion science classrooms. So as we continue to support the ELD standards through integrations with other areas, we're working with a number of departments. With the offices. With the Office of Early Learning, we have worked to create a document and also a video to help show the connections between the science of reading and our multilingual learner initiatives. We continue to expand our work with the Office of Academic Standards as we work on professional development tied directly to the content standards and the integration of the ELD standards. Working with the Office of Learning Recovery, we are providing a white paper soon, I hope, for the board based on that data that you saw at the beginning of our presentation. And we're also providing regional and PSU support based on the needs assessment. So, as you can see, through the materials that we have developed, and through the materials that we've developed, there is a collective responsibility for the success of multilingual learners, and these materials will support that. We'd like to leave you with this thought. An assets-based approach to teaching multilingual learners is about creating a culture where we acknowledge strengths and expect success. It's the shared vision that everyone must adopt before we can hope to set relevant learning goals or implement worthwhile instructional strategies for our multilingual learners. Our multilingual learners are filled with potential, and educators have the awesome opportunity to help them reach it. Thank you so much for your time.
Are there any questions about this, these standards and this approach and the work that's being done?
A quick comment. I am really proud of the work that DPI is doing in this space. I think it's right and proper that we have shifted to the nomenclature that we're using, but that's not enough.
Right.
There has to be some concrete actions behind that shift, and I'm really excited to see what you've done already and what our next steps are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Ford.
Appreciate that. I just want to again take a moment to shout out and big up the educators, because that data about the anticipated hit not being as severe as we thought it was, I mean, this is one of the populations I think we were most concerned about when we made the pivot to remote instruction and put devices in the hands of folks and expected them to be able just to discern. And I think it shows the assets you're trying to key in on with the language shift, that families and students have the capacity to learn, of course, but also that there are educators who are standing in the gap daily, who are expert pedagogues, making sure that they're delivering quality instruction. So I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that and appreciate those educators.
Thank you.
Sorry, I missed your hand. It's okay.
It's also more of a comment than a question, but I actually learned English shortly before starting school, and I speak Spanish at home.
and growing up, I like had never seen any like dual language immersion classes. Like usually, just students who spoke other languages kind of just had to fend for themselves and like learn, like just figure it out, I guess. And so it's really good to see. Like it's incredible to see that students are now getting the opportunity to be able to learn in both languages or in the language that they speak at home or that they just speak in general, because some of them don't even know English. And I didn't even know that dual language immersion classes existed until a couple months ago when a teacher I'm super close with actually has one of those classes, and I had no idea they existed until I saw her grading some paperwork in Spanish, and I was like, that's not English. And she's like, no, yeah, like all my students speak Spanish, and I was like, that's great, that's incredible, because I didn't see any of that growing up, and it's great to see that these kids are getting that opportunity.
Well, if you don't mind me sharing, North Carolina was identified in a recent publication as being the 5th largest for the number of dual language immersion programs in the country. We're very proud of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on that, because it's meaningful to all of us to hear that. Thank you so much. Thank you for that presentation. We'll look forward to seeing great results from these changes in this work. We have several action items. We discussed these at length at our last meeting, and so the staff is just going to do a quick little update on each one and of course feel free to ask questions. SLA 1 is Alternative Schools Accountability Model Options for 2022-23. Dr. Howard, still there?
Good morning. This is approval of those alternative accountability model plans for those schools that have elected to develop their own system for the 22-23 school year, and there are no updates from the information that was shared last month.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. SLA 2, there is a little bit that we need to discuss on this one. Career and College Promise Agreement. It's a new state board policy. Ms. Shaw Coltrane.
Hello, everybody. So we did get feedback from the North Carolina Community College system that some of their colleges felt like we should do these partnership agreements, not with every PSU, but focus on the LEAs first to gain traction. I feel like that is a positive step in the right direction, and we'll continue to work towards all of our PSUs having these agreements in place, so that way our students have the policies and practices in place so we can continue to support our students in this dual enrollment space.
And just to clarify, this doesn't mean that any student in a charter school that's involved in the dual enrollment has to stop.
Correct. All students will continue to have access just like they do now. This additional requirement, we're going to focus on the 115 LEAs, which is where most of our students are. So we can do that and then kind of phase it in.
Any questions?
I do have a question. I've had a couple of questions
Sure.
about and some concerns about this item, and I may not be altogether clear on it either.
Okay.
But let's say a charter school doesn't have an MOU with a community college, and that is possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that rules out the charter school from the opportunity that
No.
it doesn't.
No, ma'am. So the legislation provides this opportunity for any college and or school district or charter who wants to provide this opportunity to their students. It does not require an MOU. What we have seen is that we need, as we continue this program and grow it, we really need to get some things in place. And like our state board members, Dr. Tipton Rogers, said, well, it's just good practice. It is good practice. And a lot of colleges and schools do that already, but there are some that may not be, and that's where we want to help them understand. So no, this would not limit access in any way, shape, or form.
Right, any other questions? All right, thank you, Ms. Shaw Coltrane. SLA 3 is a report to the General Assembly, progress on the implementation of the Career and College Ready Graduates Program.
Good morning. We presented on this last month. There are no changes to this. This month we are taking the report to you for action so that we can submit that to the General Assembly.
All right, any questions, further questions on this item?
Thank you.
Dr. Mullenix. SLA 4, also a report to the General Assembly on the 5th grade career awareness program. Is Ms. White here? All right, well, just to remind everyone, each LEA is encouraged to implement a career awareness program for 5th graders, and this is a required report on that program over the last year. The good news is that 91% of our LEAs are involved in such activities, covering all 16 career clusters, CT career clusters. SLA 5 is the annual report from the Council on Educational Services for Exceptional Children for 2021-22. Do we have anyone here who can speak to that? Again, this council serves as an advisory function to this board, and the recommendations in the report cover mental health support and training, emergency action plans, summer recovery programs, recruitment and retention of teachers, and a request for members of the state board to be participatory in council meetings, which we are working on. So that's SLA 5. One discussion item, SLA 6, is also a report to the General Assembly, Read to Achieve State Summary Data Report, and Dr. Ryan is going to walk us through this.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, and members of the board and colleagues and stakeholders. Thank you for your time. We're going to review the data mentioned here that aligns to General Statute 115C 8310. So the first slide is just a reminder of the waivers that we've had in place since COVID, which is followed by a slide that also lists the multiple vendors, the different vendors that we've had for Read to Achieve implementation assessments along the same timeline. So you can see our latest this year was DIPLS 8, and it's our first year, our baseline for science of reading alignment. So that's where this data will come from that we'll go through shortly. So one of the first slides that you have with data, this was publicly published already with the EdNC article, recognizing the general information about our data and how we performed on Amplify. And North Carolina did outpace other states across the nation in K-2 at each grade level. You can see here. And it's promising, but we recognize there's also work to be done. But I did want to bring that to your attention as a celebration for our state and where we are as far as outpacing other states across. And Amplify does serve every state, just different varying levels. And so the next slide digs a little deeper into the subgroups. We'll take a deeper dive. And this is new information you may not have seen. This is kindergarten specifically, and you'll see the subgroups here and where we began with each subgroup for beginning of year, which is fairly low in a lot of those subgroups. But you'll also notice by end of year, there were some significant gains across the subgroups. For all, you'll see there's a 33-point gain, Asian 24, white 44, black 37, Hispanic 41. And so we recognize we're going to celebrate that growth because we are closing gaps, but we also want to recognize the fact that that's not where we want to end. We still have students who need support, and we'll continue to focus on that as well. The next slide is grade 1, very similar. You'll see that there are similar trends here. Started out with lower proficiency, and there are gaps there initially, but the overall gains and growth is something we can celebrate. If you look at the trends there, all was 21 points, but then when you get into like white, black, and Hispanic, Hispanic students, the gains, actually all of them are pretty comparable, and that's the thing I think we want to focus on is as we're moving forward, and one of the trainings we're doing now is focusing on not only annual growth but catch-up growth, so that we can make sure that we're focusing on all subgroups and how we can make sure we're catching everyone up. While the trends look great and the growth looks comparable, we want to make sure that we're closing those gaps instead of increasing those gaps. Grade 2, same thing here, similar trends, lower overall outcomes with the evidence of impact and loss foundational skills. If you were a second grade student, you missed half of kindergarten and all of first grade, and so you're seeing as students get older in second and third grade, those foundational skills and the lack of having those face-to-face did impact these students, and it's showing up in our second and third grades. So we're working to try to recover some of that for those kiddos as well, and that goes back to that annual and catch-up growth. And then the next one is grade 3. You'll see some amazing outcomes with some of our kiddos, and then you'll see some that the gap is starting to get larger and it's getting extremely concerning. So this year we're focusing on making sure that we are aligning not only the annual and catch-up growth and what we're focusing on there, but aligning those individual reading plans that's in the legislation. It's not something that's isolated or it needs to be integrated into what's happening with MTSS as well as the instructional shifts that they're starting to make. So in the next piece of data, I sent a Friday update on this, but I still think it's important because it is the first year that we're looking at early literacy program requirements. And so I wanted to make sure that we shared this information today. The first slide you'll see are the participation rates of our NC pre-K educators and where they are in the letters training. We have about 3,200 educators in preschools that are in letters training currently. And then the next slide, one of the requirements in legislation also says not only are we tracking those educators, but what resources have we provided to make sure that they have some supports in those resources. And so if you have half a day, if you want to dig into these resources, there are a ton of resources out there, and we continue to share those, not only with our preschool, but with K-5 as well. And so these are some links that we have shared that have a lot of deep dives into resources that are aligned to science of reading and supporting there. And then the next slide is the third requirement in our new legislation, and it talks about students who demonstrate kindergarten readiness and also who do not demonstrate kindergarten readiness. So we use Teaching Strategies Gold to look at kindergarten readiness, and it's broken down by the domains you see here. The first two are specific to literacy, and in preschool they use the entire platform and all the domains and elements there. In kindergarten, we have a select number that we use for kindergarten readiness. So that's why that they may not match up when you're looking at kindergarten readiness versus how they're coming out of preschool. But in language and literacy, you'll see it says about 85% and 88.7% met or exceeded benchmarks for language and literacy. But the discussion that we're starting to have as we're digging deeper and what legislation is looking like is this is not necessarily assessing literacy aligned with the science of reading. This is looking at the whole child, which is what we do need when we're looking at the overall kindergartner coming into kindergarten. But we do need to dig deeper to see what do they have and what skills do they not have when they're coming in specific to literacy and learning to read. So in the next slide, we've talked about the considerations and things that we continue to work with our multiple agencies who do govern preschool. It's not just DPI. And having conversations with them. And in one of the conversations, we did talk about how this data is a bit concerning because we want to make sure we're collecting everything in alignment. And while the proficiencies look promising, when you look at the kindergarten readiness, it doesn't look the same. So there are some gaps there. One conversation we have had recently is the intent of looking at some sort of literacy screener so that we do have something early on from preschool, because if the teachers and the educators are being trained in science of reading, then how are they assessing to make sure that their instruction is shifting and it's effective? And so we did meet with Dr. Lucy Hart-Paulson, who is one of the creators of the Early Childhood Letters program with Louisa Moats, and she gave us some information that we're going to take back and work with DHHS and some of our other partners on about what we can do to look at that. The two primary predictors of success for our kiddos is alphabetic principle and phonemic awareness. And so are we measuring those in depth early? And so those are conversations that we are having. The next piece, we did share out a little earlier, I think it was in our working session last month. You'll see the pre and post data for our letters professional growth report. And so in cohort 1, they've completed volume 1, and they started with 59% proficient, and they've gained to 87% proficient. In February or March, we'll start to look at what does that look like for cohort 2, are we increasing, and then where there are gaps, what supports do we have in place, and that's where our consultants are working with them. The next, literacy intervention plans. Each year you typically have a hodgepodge of all kinds of interventions that every district uses. And so the one thing that literacy intervention plan has done is really start to align what that looks like with a systematic approach. And so if you click on the link here, it will take you to what the template looks like. And all districts sent us a draft last year of their literacy intervention plan, and we gave feedback. Is it aligned? Is it not aligned? What are some recommendations if it's not aligned? And what supports do you need? I am happy to report they have all submitted on time, all 100%, we have 100% of them, their literacy intervention plans for this year, and all are aligned or aligned with recommendations. And so we're following up to help them as well. So it's very promising to see all the shifts that are already happening in the conversations around does your curriculum, does your content, does your support align to the science of reading, and are we shifting away from balanced literacy? On the next, one thing I will say that really quick, we did ask them we did a survey and said, is there anything outside of your intervention plan that you've used to support children? And the list was only about 2 pages, and that should be in the JLUC report, which is much smaller than what we've had in the past, and you're not seeing things like puzzles and things that felt a little more random in the past. Which takes us to our Read to Achieve website posting. So one of the pieces we're supposed to report is whether or not the data has been shared. And so on the next slide, you'll see that they have all 100% of our LEAs have posted their Read to Achieve data, and it's on their websites. And 99% of our charters, we're still just missing one charter that has not posted, and we're working with them to get that worked on. And that information has been shared and publicly out there for their communities and parents to see. Which now brings us to our Read to Achieve summative proficiency reports. And so here you will see that we have trend data. In 2018-19 pre-COVID, we were at 71% in grade 1. We took a big dip there post-COVID in 2021. And then in 2022, you'll see we are coming back to 63%, but not where we want to be, but we are making those gains, which is promising. And then in grade 2, you'll see the same thing, 78%, but there is the gain is not as high as the grade 1 was, but we know that we have some work to do, and we talked about the foundational pieces that those kiddos are missing. So, but we are recovering a little, and we have to keep going from there. Grade 3, you'll see as the students get older, it gets a little harder. They were at 57%. That first row is basically just your beginning of grade, your end of grade, your Read to Achieve, and your retakes, kind of your summative assessments that you were talking about earlier. You'll see the proficiencies from 57% down to 43, back up to 47. And then the second row is pathways or good cause exemptions. So they're at 51% and they're at 41% now. So the pathways might be an alternative assessment that we amplify, or a district choice of their alternative assessment that's approved. Portfolios, something like that too. So let's dig into the subgroups here. And then when you start looking at subgroups, you're going to see their major discrepancies we have to work on when it comes to, this is not measuring necessarily how they're learning to read. This is how they've actually are applying that knowledge once they're able to read. And so you'll see the discrepancies, but I know that's something we always kind of want to watch because there are lots of things hidden in averages. And overall, 47% is not where we want to be, so we know that we have work to do. And again, that was just for your summative assessments, and this is for your pathways. And then the last piece of information is about the reading camp proficiency reports. So those students who attended reading camps, grade 1, you had 9% who were proficient after reading camps. Grade 2, 8%, and grade 3, 15%. And those are conversations we're already having, because those are low proficiencies for the number of students and the number of money that we're putting into reading camps. So there has to be some kind of shift, and we're trying to make sure, which really helps with these literacy intervention plans, because we need to be more proactive. We can see here reactive is not working. And ultimately, the legislation says they only have to have 72 hours of reading instruction. You can't really make a lot of shifting happen in 72 hours. And the educators are working hard. It's not because they're not working hard, but it's just there's things we have to work on there. And any questions?
A lot of information in this report.
Yes.
So I'm sure there will be some questions.
Okay.
I saw him go up, but was it you, Dr. Oxley?
Yes, thank you,
Mhm.
Ms. Candace. If you'll go back to the previous slide with your proficiencies from summer. Rightfully so, it needs to be investigated, needs to be studied. Where do you plan to begin studying, looking at the problem, the root cause?
So we're aligning ourselves a little bit to what Dr. Marr is already doing with recovery and OLR, to look at specifically, do we need to identify what the priority students who those students are, how are we making sure that we're aligned. Right now, pre-Science of Reading, reading camps were not even aligned necessarily in some cases to what was happening during the school year. So are we making sure that that is included in the interventions? Is it still aligned? And looking at those efforts, because we do have highly qualified teachers that are doing the best they can. But when you're looking at 72 hours of instruction to try to close those gaps, that's almost impossible in a lot of cases. But we're working with Dr. Marr's division.
Do you take a look at resources that are used by the teachers? I mean, what resources are in the hands of students?
They have to include those now in the literacy intervention plans, and they are starting to make sure they're aligned to Science of Reading. So it may be that it's Haggerty. It may be that it's Letterland, depending on the grade level. But the curriculum itself is aligned. But I think one of the questions is, are we being too reactive and expecting this to happen in 72 hours? And so if we start earlier, what might that look like throughout the year as opposed to on the tail end in summer?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great questions, but lots of things we have to work on. So, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just a comment. It's this further proof that remediation doesn't work.
That's right.
It's acceleration that we need to work on during the school year. And we need to remember that the legislation that Dr. Ryan is referring to was just passed in April of 2021.
Yes.
So
Baseline.
teachers and districts are in the process of shifting what they've always done to Science of Reading aligned instruction. And we can see from the data that the growth that we're having, that shift is pointing us in the right direction in terms of exceeding where we were before.
Great points, absolutely.
Any other questions for Dr. Ryan?
Thank you.
Dr. Ryan. We have 3 consent items. SLA 7 is changes to the 2021-22 school accountability and student performance data, graduation rates, and cohort rates. If you'll recall, when this data was presented to us, the districts the LEAs have an opportunity to correct errors. And so this chart shows changes in the status for individual schools where there was a change. SLA 8 is a report to the North Carolina General Assembly, high school diploma endorsement and increase in access to career and technical education awarding endorsements. This report includes diploma endorsement and CTE credentials earned in the last school year. A particular note is that the number of endorsements that would have been awarded to graduates without the ACT/SAT benchmark reading requirement represents an increase of 16% from the previous year, which is great. SLA 9 is also a report to the General Assembly on the 4-year cohort graduation rate. The report is, it's reported for all LEAs, and if you look at the chart, those who've met the state target of 88.6 are highlighted in blue, so that will pop out at you. And that concludes the SLA committee. Chair Davis, except Vice Chair Duncan.
Going back to SLA 6 for a moment, we just got this report last night, and I know a lot of us read it last night and went through it. I have a lot of questions, which I don't think are germane to take up everybody's time. Will this be an item that we can discuss when we come up at the next meeting, or do we have, before we approve it?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because nobody had time really to dive into this ahead of time, so absolutely, yes. And I'm sure Dr. Ryan will be responsive if you've got questions.
Yeah, I think probably that would be helpful to get that out of the way before we get to the meeting, and I'll try to do that with some of the questions I've got.
All right,
Thank you.
all right, Chair Davis.
Thank you, Ms. Kamnitz. We'll now turn to the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools, led by Ms. Amy White. Ms. White.
Good morning, Chair Davis, colleagues. Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy White. I chair the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee, along with Jill Kamnitz. We have a couple things on our agenda today. The only action item that we have is a rule change, a necessary rule change that evolved out of an action taken by the state board in July of 2021. And so the Office of Charter Schools suggested to the state board that it would be advantageous for charter schools who were making an application to the state to move that application date up from July, the last Friday in July, to the last Friday in April. And when we took that action, it was necessary for us to make a rule change as well. There's a process that's followed, including a public comment section. And so we're back before you today. Ms. Beccaro can give us an update with a approval for this rule that will allow us to move that application date again from the last Friday in July to the last Friday in April. Ms. Beccaro, any highlights that you'd like to add?
No, you pretty much covered it. We are on track to have an effective date sometime in December of this year, and then at that point we will notice and post information regarding the 2023 charter school application process. There was a required hearing held on August 18th. There was no public comment, and the public comment period ended at the end of September. So we've had no objections.
Wonderful. Questions? Okay, hearing none. We'll move to our discussion items. Board members, we're gonna combine EICS 2 and 3 because Ms. Beccaro will be leading in both of those discussions. EICS 2 is a report to the General Assembly on the extension that was provided for our virtual charter schools. If you'll remember, because of COVID relief, the General Assembly, the original 2020 enrollment allowance was rewritten, and the extension was offered to those schools to increase its enrollment by a certain number. And as a part of that provision, we are required to make a report to them specifically about those enrollment increases. And so Ms. Beccaro is going to share with us that report. It's separated because EICS 3 is the report on the general virtual charter school pilot program. So we thought it was important to show you that enrollment report first and then fold into the second. Is that okay with you guys? She got two separate PowerPoints, but it's all combined. Therefore, Ms. Beccaro, welcome, and we're excited to hear what you have to share with us.
All right, thank you so much. Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, and members of the board. So as Ms. White said, I do have two virtual charter school reports for you today. This first one is going to focus on what we call the expansion students. And during the 2020 and 2021 school years, during the pandemic, there were enrollment increases allowed via statute for the two virtual charter schools. So we have two virtual charter schools. They are part of a pilot program. It began in 2015, and it has been extended several times and now is slated to end at the end of the 2024-25 school year. So we've got a couple more years set. The original enrollment cap was set at 2,592, and there have been some waivers that have been allowed. For the, as you can see here on this slide, for the pandemic years, the 2020, 2021 years, North Carolina Cyber was allowed to increase enrollment by 1,000 students, and North Carolina Virtual by 2,800 students. This was in legislation. As part of the legislation, those enrollment increases did not extend past the 21-22 school year. However, at the August 4th State Board meeting, there was a motion adopted which allows North Carolina Cyber to enroll up to 2,705 students and virtual up to 3,425 students. At that point, there was a stipulation in that motion that no new students can be enrolled during this school year to replace any of those withdrawals until they are back at their statutory cap of 2,592. As of last week, just for your information, Cyber Academy had 2,575 students enrolled, and they are reporting a wait list of 678 students. Virtual Academy has 3,013 students, and they are reporting a wait list of 2,878 students. I will say that there's a pretty good mix of elementary, middle school, and high school students that are on the wait list, but definitely the majority are high school students that are trying to get into the programs. The expansion during the pandemic included a reporting requirement, and that's what I'm reporting for you today, and why we've kind of separated those reports, because it specifically asked that we address just the kids that are enrolled over the cap. So if we look at North Carolina Cyber, I'm going to kind of break it down school by school just to make it a little bit easier to digest. North Carolina Cyber enrolled 1,007 students above the cap, and their ADM for that school year was 2,715. If you look here, you can see kind of the breakdown with the majority of those students falling into the high school grade levels. North Carolina Virtual Academy chose to cap enrollment at 3,439. As you know, they were allowed a pretty large expansion of 2,800 students. They didn't take on that many students, but their average daily membership for the year was 3,285. This school, as opposed to Cyber, you can see they really limited the number of high schoolers, and they took on no seniors. If we look at the previous school, the vast majority of students enrolling in the virtual charter schools previously attended traditional district schools. Racial demographics for the schools are almost very similar. In some cases, only a percent difference. And this data pretty much aligns also with what we will see when we look at the whole, the school as a whole with their total enrollment, where we have a majority of students demographically not non-white. And then Virtual Academy, you can see, is very similar with their demographics. For economic disadvantage, Virtual enrolled 44% economically disadvantaged students for those expansion students, and Cyber 60%. And if we look at the schools as a whole, both of those schools are classified as Title I schools. So this is academics, and again, we're just looking at the expansion students. So of those expansion students that were in the testing grades 3 to 8, 83% of them were enrolled at the time of EOG testing. And really the biggest takeaway from looking at the data, and this again will mirror what we see when we look at the school as a whole, is that there are lower proficiency levels in math, and in some cases the reading scores are more than double what we saw for the math scores. This is looking at their high school academics for the enrollment, or excuse me, for the expansion students. And the ACT proficiency scores here are calculated at the new 19, composite score of 19 or above. So this shows North Carolina Virtual Academy, and this is showing the proficiency levels of the expansion students. And just like North Carolina Cyber, we see that the math scores are significantly lower than what we're seeing in the reading or the science. And this is their high school, and again, they took on no seniors or students that should be seniors graduating that year, so they did not have a graduation rate for those expansion students. And finally, our last data point for the expansion students is the withdrawal rate, which is required to be calculated for both of these virtual charter schools annually. And in the legislation, there are specific exemptions for what they can kind of count out of their rate. But if we look just at the expansion students, North Carolina Cyber had a 13% withdrawal rate, and virtual nearly 27%. And the schools report that the majority of withdrawals are for students that indicate that the program just was not what they expected or did not meet their needs. So that is kind of the narrow view of the expansion students. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take those now.
Questions about this section of the report? Okay, seeing none, we'll proceed to what is technically EICS 3, and this is the report that we have to offer to the General Assembly on the pilot program and all of the data related to the pilot programs. Ms. McCarron.
All right, thank you. Okay, so this will take a look at the program as a whole at both of the schools. We'll look at the background, student enrollment and withdrawals, instructional programming, student performance, implementation, and recommendations. As we just talked about, the pilot began in 2015, and now it's slated to end in 2025. In the original legislation, there have been several reporting requirements. So you've heard at least 2 other, I believe, reports on the virtual charter schools. The pilot legislation outlines several requirements governing the virtual schools, including everything from enrollment to funding. But in general, the 2 charter schools, or virtual charter schools, are subject to the same type of expectations and requirements that are laid out in the charter school law. For enrollment, like we talked about, the cap is 2,592. We had those COVID expansions, and then we've had some other exceptions that you have approved, which is allowed via legislation. And now we are at the maxes that you have set in your August meeting, and until they get back down to their cap. All right, so looking at North Carolina Cyber Academy, and this is looking at the total enrollment increase for the life of the program. We have seen a cumulative enrollment increase of nearly 92%, so 91.8%. The withdrawals have really varied. We had a low in 2020 and a high in 2018. North Carolina Cyber, if you recall, was originally called North Carolina Connections, and they were partnered with the EMO Pearson. That split was rather contentious, and that occurred in 2018, which I believe probably had something to do with the withdrawals we saw that year. The withdrawal rate per legislation should be below 25%, and within the report you'll see details on the different types of exemptions and the withdrawal rates over the time of the program. For North Carolina Virtual Academy, they have seen a cumulative enrollment increase of nearly 143%, and they have also had a low of withdrawals in 2020 and then a high in 2018. The report goes into detail about the different instructional programming, but kind of as a sum, both of the schools report that students receive synchronous and asynchronous instruction. The average time reported is between 2 and 3 hours for synchronous live instruction, but the time online really will depend on the student's age, the need, and the efficiency of the student. Both schools offer classes in honors and AP and a wide variety of electives. And in the report, you can see a full course listing as well as a list of the different software and curriculum choices that the schools have elected to use. So this is exciting to finally have some accountability data that we can look at. The virtual charter schools are subject to the same end of grade testing and accountability requirements of your normal brick and mortar schools. And they are also subject to being designated as low performing or continually low performing. So if we recall, a continually low performing charter school is one that has been designated as low performing for at least 2 of the 3 consecutive years. And based on that, both of these schools are considered continually low performing. So we're going to take a little more detailed look into each school individually. So Cyber Academy, you can see here from the bottom up, it's showing you the most recent at the top. There has been a performance grade of a D and a growth status of not met throughout the life of the program, and a growth index variation between -11 and -17 on average. This is looking at our subgroup data for last year. So we have this is again North Carolina Cyber Academy. We have all subgroups receiving either a subgroup letter grade of an F or a D, with the exception of the Asian subgroup. This is taking a look at the school data broken down by grade and subject area. And just like we saw when we kind of narrowed in at the very at the expansion students, we are definitely seeing lower scores for math proficiency. So you'll see the where I have it kind of outlined in red, those are would be your grade, like level proficiency. And so you can see The math scores there really tend to be between 20 and 30%. Some of them are a bit higher. But what's interesting is that there is really there's nothing we can really look at in terms of age level. So the scores are varying between those 20 and 30% brackets, but there's not anything we see jumping out in terms of one age group performing better or worse than another. If we look at the next one, so this is showing you the reading and the science, and as you can see, reading and science are generally at least 10 to sometimes a bit higher, percent points higher in proficiency. So definitely reading is outperforming in terms of math at the virtual schools. But again, here we don't have anything standing out in terms of grade level. We can't look at this data and say that, our elementary school students are doing better with reading through virtual instruction as opposed to, another grade level. All right, this is North Carolina Virtual, so you will see that they also have received a D and a not met growth status through the life of the program, and they have a growth index variation between about -8 and -17%. So it's kind of gone up and down, as you can see here with the data. And then again, if we look at the subgroups, this is similar to North Carolina Cyber, with all subgroups receiving an SLG of either an F or a D, with the exception of the Asian subgroup. So this is Virtual Academy broken down by grade level and subject area. And as we saw with the other school, we see higher reading proficiency, but no significant differences between grade levels. So that's math, and then the next slide will show you the scores for reading proficiency, the students at level 3 or above. The next slide is going to look at North Carolina Cyber Academy and state grade level proficiency in college and career readiness. And so this will show you that cyber's proficiency levels contrasted to the state, and the state on average outperforms by about 8%. And then this is virtuals, and also you'll see that the state outperforms on average by about 12%. So this year was interesting because we now have LEA traditional districts that are offering full-time virtual academies, and those virtual academies, which have elected to be full-time virtual and have their own LEA code, now also have accountability data. So we did look at the virtual academies as a whole and for comparative data, and there are 35 total that we had in the accountability data. 4 of those for their SPG had an I, so they did not have enough data for a letter grade. 12 had an F, 11 had a D, and 8 had a C. There were none that had received an A or a B. 6 of the 35 qualified as Title I schools, and 2 of those 6 are the virtual charter schools. Another thing I found quite interesting was of the schools, the 12 that had received an F performance grade, there was no correlation of grades served. So it really was just, literally every mix of grade levels you could have. There was a pre-K to 12 school, a K to 12, K to 8, K to 6, 6 to 12, and 6 to 8. So that was just interesting data where we might have assumed there would be some type of pattern with age level. There was not. All right, so graduation rates, we also report on this throughout the life of the program, and you can see that the graduation rates are improving, but they are still lagging behind the state rate. And the latest ones is to the right, on the right. Now, if we move into the demographics, the racial demographic data shows the largest disparity arising in the Hispanic enrollment. And this is, if you recall our charter school annual report, this is also what we see in general in charter schools. We see fewer Hispanic students as opposed to other demographics. This is our federal, the data that is reported for economically disadvantaged students. So you can see the outline is our last head count, which was in December 2021, for economically disadvantaged students, and both of the cyber schools, virtual schools, are over 50%. And then you can see it compared to charters and all traditionals. This is our students with disabilities, and again, this is the federal headcount data pulled from CEDARS. And North Carolina Cyber had 14.05% students with disabilities, and Virtual Academy had 11%. So pretty, similar to what we're seeing in the charters and the traditional publics. There is there's much more detailed funding information within the report itself, but just to kind of give an outline of the state funding, you can see cyber on the second row and virtual under it, just the funding changes over the course of the program. When it started, it was about $7.5 million for each program, and now cyber is over $20 million and virtual over $22 million. And then to wrap out the funding, we've got federal funding here, and you can see that there's also been obviously with the increase in enrollment, there's been an increase in the funding, and quite a significant one with the increase in federal funding in general during the pandemic. So again, there's much more funding information in the report. And then finally, to close us out, the General Assembly has asked that these reports include some type of recommendation. So the 2020 reports that was approved by this board and went through also CSAB recommendations. There were some recommendations. One was that these schools report and present to CSAB. That did occur. They were presenting quarterly up until last year. They were asked to conduct surveys on student experience, as well as some other items within the schools themselves, to conduct those surveys. That data was sent to our office, and that has been summarized in the report towards the end of the report. And then finally, that there's disaggregated academic data, which we do have and has been presented here today. So the new recommendation, and this is actually in line with what the legislation stated in the latest extension of the program, is rather than continuing to expand or extend this program over and over legislatively, if we could just get it to roll into the actual charter school renewals process. Our office and the Charter Schools Advisory Board thinks that makes the most sense. It allows for things like timeline transparency. Right now, it's really hard to talk to stakeholders and let them know, what the status of these schools are, because the extensions often come just a few months before it's about to run out. So these two schools had begun the 2-year renewal process, and then we stopped that obviously when they were extended to 2024. It also allows our office just to prepare the data and the items and the materials that we want to prepare for CSAB and for this board to make really rational and data-driven renewal decisions. So that would be our recommendation, and it is in line with the current legislation. Are there any questions? Comments?
I just had a quick question. I know that there was, thank you so much for all of the information, and there was the data around the different grade levels and the comparison between some of those district virtual worlds as well. Was there any comparison at least in the high school realm with North Carolina virtual?
No, we didn't.
And comparing to these academies as well?
We did not. This report did not cover that. That has been brought up before, and because North Carolina Virtual Public School isn't like a full-time virtual school, but rather kind of provides like courses to schools, and schools elect to use it in different ways. That hasn't really, it seems to be kind of comparing like apples to oranges rather than, the only reason we included these is because now they're full-time virtual schools that are a little bit more comparable to a full-time virtual instruction.
Yeah, I only asked that because I know when you mentioned like the asynchronous versus basically the live sessions versus the do-it-yourself sessions.
Yeah.
I mean, they have like some of those similarities in both.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know if there was any comparisons in that area. Okay.
For further questions? Yes, Vice Chair Duncan.
Is bringing up the North Carolina virtual schools, you recall there was a performance audit 2 or 3 years ago that suggested certification for courses beyond the number that were certified. Is there any certification requirement for any of these virtual school courses?
Not that I know of.
I guess the second question I had was, with respect to the academies that you referred to or made reference to, you didn't have the growth data incorporated with that. You just had the performance score, proficiency score.
Yes, I did pull the full data. It's in the report.
Yeah.
I just kind of outlined the student performance grades, but and you can actually, like, on the accountability website, you are able to kind of filter, and that's how I was able to decide, like, kind of know where the charter schools landed, which is really, if you're looking, like, top to bottom, it's basically in the middle of those. So that is in the report.
All right, you might be able to filter it. I might not be
Okay.
able to filter it. But, all right, well, thank you.
Yeah, it is. It's in there, but I can also, if you have any specific questions, just.
Well, last question I have is, if, according to the recommendations that are being made, right now by legislation, these schools must continue to exist through 24-25, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm understanding the recommendation right, you would have to start the certification process no later than the start of the 23-24 school year.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And they have kind of started that. We would start over with them, but they have an idea of what the process is because they started. I'm fairly certain we did the school, like, interviews and visits and all of those things. So they would just kind of wrap back into that and do those again. But yes, you're correct. It's a 2-year process, so it would start in 2023.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think it bears mentioning that Ms. Kamnitz and I also talked with staff about further disaggregation of the data by grade level, particularly when you talk about school performance grades and the letter grades, and giving further clarity and transparency about K-5 and the performance for students that are enrolled K-5, 6 to 8, which would be middle school, 9 to 12 versus the high schools. It may reveal or it put a punctuation mark on or peel back the Band-Aid on where those schools offer higher quality instruction or better performance results by grade level as opposed to the whole holistic K-5, K-12. So we talked about looking at that data. We didn't discuss in this committee, but I think it would also be interesting to devise a method of looking at the performance of the students as they choose to enroll in the schools. At the elementary level, you would assume, particularly if they were kindergarten students, you would say, okay, the parents have chosen this as their charter school for kindergarten. But after that, then you would assume that they would be leaving the public school classroom or a classroom of some sort. So it bears, the question is the instruction, is the student performing better or worse than they did when they were in the traditional classroom? Superintendent.
I absolutely agree with that, Ms. White, and I've been thinking throughout your great presentation. Thank you, by the way. You did a really good job. I would like to know more about these students that perhaps is not required by legislation and might not be in the report. But do we know where, what districts these students are coming from? Do we? Yeah.
It is. The list of that will be, it should be in the report, but they basically come from all districts. And the schools kind of differ in what kind of information they are collecting on the students. So that would definitely be something we could recommend to the students, that they start to keep that information, collect that data a little bit more. consistently, but we are seeing that it really is a wide variety of reasons, and I would say probably the majority of the parents are reporting that they are just looking for something different. So it's what that difference is might be, could be very complex and could be very varied, but that is what they are telling the schools.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Carver.
Is there that wait list number, did it shock anybody else? That wait list number just seemed huge.
Yeah.
Has that number increased since COVID?
I have some more data on that, and I do believe it has. I believe definitely the high school number, and I'm not sure what is causing that, but definitely, there's over 1,000 at cyber that are high schoolers trying to get into the program, and then at it's the same at virtual, so almost 1,200 at virtual are high schoolers. So perhaps, I don't know, but I would assume perhaps that they got used to that type of instruction during the pandemic. Yeah.
Many students who thrived on that type of instruction and did wonderfully. And it seems like we need more opportunities if the model is, when we can prove the model is working well for which students and how to make it work better.
Students, right?
Right.
Yeah.
If we can prove that, then it would be great if we could provide that opportunity for the students who would thrive in it, because there were many of my students who did great as well. But that number shocked me, how many people want that now, because so many people said they want to be in school. We need to have every opportunity available for any student to be successful in the avenue through which they would best learn.
And Vice Chair Duncan.
Following up on your comment, if you were trying to disaggregate the data, which I agree makes sense in the superintendent's comment, to get further information, the withdrawals were notably significant. And so how are you going to get the data on the withdrawals and the follow-up of where the withdrawals ended up and what the withdrawals data looks like, if that's even obtainable? And it may not be, of course, but it seems to me it gets to be a complicated process, and it's complicated in no small part by the extremely high percentage of withdrawals.
We also talked about that in our pre-committee meeting, and I used the word turbulence and the in and out and the impact on longevity and consistency of teaching throughout the year, and the impact on the school and how many days are required for the student to be present in X school before the testing is valid. So is it 45 days or 90 days out that the student could be enrolled? We learned through pre-committee that I think the virtual charters stop allowing enrollment after February, which means the student would have to be enrolled for February. But there is getting a handle on what that turbulence, or if you want to call it school hopping, it has its impact on those students and their performance. Superintendent Pruitt.
This is purely anecdotal, but it speaks to what I think we're all agreeing about. When I think back to my time in Johnston County in a high school, there were, of course, students who were chronically absent, and their parents didn't know it. But then there were students who were chronically absent and their parents did know it. And it wasn't that they didn't care about their child, it's that they were so sympathetic to their child that they didn't require their student to be in school. And I know that's hard for some of us to get our heads around, but it could be because the child had an undiagnosable learning difference that just made it too painful for that child to be at school. Or it could be that the child had an odd physical ailment, also not diagnosable, and there weren't other options for the child. And so, it wasn't my place to pass judgment on parents, but I did have students every year whose parents were very well aware that their student was not attending school regularly. And I can't help but think that had there been this option, or had more parents been aware of these options, that school hopping certainly would have been, we need to learn more about the phenomenon of school hopping because it's real.
It is. Yes. Okay, any other comments or questions? Ms. Becerra, thank you very much
You're
for the work
welcome.
you did, along with your team, to pull that data together to meet the requirement of our report to the General Assembly. We will shift now to the last item on our agenda. This is EICS 4, and this is the annual review of the NC Access Grant, and I believe, hello, Jay Whalen.
Hello,
Welcome.
good morning.
We're excited to hear from you today.
I'm excited to be here as well. Yeah, thank you. I do have hard copies. You got soft copies of the actual printed report. We do have hard copies as well. And I will note that we created a digital version on our website that we hope is a little more accessible and easy to navigate for the public. So that is also available. But good morning, board members, Superintendent Truitt. My name is Jay Whalen. I'm the program administrator for the Access Program. And I am very excited to be here and talk to you a little bit about some of the progress that we've made over the course of the last year. Our report specifically goes through the summer, through the end of June, really. But at this point, we are now 4 years into the program. And so with one official year remaining on our state grant, I will talk a little bit about what that means at the end of the presentation. So just to begin briefly with a bit of the previous year at a glance, in July 2021, we completed our third competitive subgrant cycle. And so 19 new subgrantees were awarded, totaling $10.8 million at the conclusion of that cycle, which meant that in August of 2021, 51 subgrantees were currently implementing at the beginning of the school year. And those schools were serving nearly 30,000 students. And we had an additional 8 subgrantees that were in the planning year, continuing to prepare for the launch of their school. In September of 2021, we also began the third cohort of the Access Fellowship, and we had 46 fellows included in that third cohort. That included 4 traditional public school principals using the state's Restart model. We've been very fortunate to partner with the Restart team here at DPI, and we have expanded that program this year, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit as well. In December, we held a special competition for replication subgrants, and we awarded 2 replication schools in December of 2021, totaling $2.4 million. And then in May of 2022, that was sort of the culmination of a year-long effort of programmatic monitoring. We monitored 37 subgrantees throughout the entire year, and that is a big part of our focus last year and moving forward. Now that we've gotten through awarding the majority of the funds to our schools, we have shifted very heavily to the programmatic and fiscal monitoring piece of the program. In June 2022, we were very excited to bring 12 of our aspiring minority school leaders who completed the add-on licensure program at Appalachian State in the partnership that we created with them. They went through a 2-year program, not only being leaders within their schools, but also committing to this program throughout the pandemic and completing 2 years of coursework, as well as practicum experience at their school. And I'm excited to announce, and I will talk about this in a bit as well, that 3 of those leaders have already been promoted to school leadership roles, either at their school or at another charter school throughout the state. And then finally, in July 2022, we launched a new leadership development program that we call the Transformative Executive Leadership Program. And this sort of different from the fellowship, which I will talk about, which is geared towards supporting the needs of educationally disadvantaged students. This program is specifically designed around coaching and very specific and intensive support for leaders on some of the more nuts and bolts activities of operating a charter school and being a principal, particularly in our low and continual low performing charter schools, and what it takes to transform and turn around those schools. And so the subgrant program specifically is obviously the largest investment that we make in the Access program. 90% of our funds go directly towards schools as subgrants. So that means $33.1 million of our total grant goes directly to schools. We have already met our goal of awarding 60 subgrants. We have officially awarded 62. We will actually be bringing another recommendation this afternoon to this board as well. And the awards have averaged around $530,000. They span anywhere from about $250,000 all the way up to the maximum of $1.25 million, depending on the strength of the application, the amount of growth that an applicant proposes to serve, the types of students, and the types of services that are available. And so currently that means 33 new schools, either schools that are in the planning year or schools that have been open for less than 3 years and are still in sort of this startup phase. 26 high-quality schools that have expanded their services to either add grade levels or increase the number of students that they serve, and 3 schools that are replicating high-quality models that already exist in the state. So those would be brand new schools that are replicating existing high-quality models. And then the remaining funds that we have, which will be about $1 million, we plan, and we've talked to this board about this, but we plan to use those for supplemental funds for existing subgrantees. And so we'll bring a plan back to this board for approval, but schools that are meeting their enrollment targets, meeting all of their monitoring indicators and progressing through the program and showing significant gains for students and meeting programmatic requirements would be eligible to receive supplemental funding if there are ways that they can expand their programs and services to support and serve more students. So officially, we've awarded about $33 million of the just over $33 million that we have to award. And so this is just a brief sort of snapshot. I know it's a little bit difficult to see the map on the screen, but this is just a brief snapshot of where our subgrantees are. They span the entire state of North Carolina. Obviously, there are still some clusters in the urban areas, which is just where we see naturally more charter schools throughout the state as well. But we are excited about the network that we've been able to create across the state and the amount of counties that we've been able to impact with access funds. And so to speak a little bit about the growth just generally, the charter school program at the federal level is meant to increase the number of charter schools and the number of schools that have students that have access to high quality charter schools around the nation. And so when we think about just the overall expansion in student growth, we are seeing that just within the first 3 years of the Access program. And so to date, just 3 years in, we have seen over 6,000 additional students enrolled in subgrantee charter schools. That includes about 2,400 students in our first cohort of 9 schools, about 2,000 students in our first cohort or in our second cohort of 33 schools who have just finished 2 years and are now into their 3rd year in the program. And our cohort 3 schools, which there are 19 of, have already enrolled an additional 1,500 students just in their first year alone. So now they are all in new years, and we hope to be able to pull additional enrollment data soon to be able to see what those updates look like, particularly coming out of the pandemic. And I'll talk about this a little bit. We know that enrollment and particularly some of the marketing challenges that our schools faced during the pandemic, especially as it related to in-person marketing and recruitment and really getting into the neighborhoods and communities that need these schools the most. And so I did want to step back just a bit to talk about the shifting landscape as it relates to the racial diversity. We'll talk about educationally disadvantaged, which is what our specific goals in the program are around. We don't have specific racial diversity goals, but stepping back beyond the Access program specifically, we are seeing the increased diversification of charter schools around the state. And so for the first time at the end of the 21-22 school year, charter schools served an equal number of white students as they did students of color. And so as you can see from the chart, that's been sort of a steady increase over the past decade. We know that there is more work to do, but subgrantees have started to lead the way in this effort over the past 3 years. And our subgrantees in the program right now have increased the enrollments of students of color by 53% compared to about 20% for non-subgrantees over the same 3 years. And as we get to the next slide, I'll dig into a little bit of some of those subgroups specifically, not in terms of absolute number, but in terms of percentage growth. We are seeing significant growth in the Hispanic student enrollments that we see in charter schools. They are still relatively small compared to the white and black student subgroups, but over a 500% increase in Hispanic students over the course of the past decade, and also significant increases in the other students of color subgroups that I've grouped into other students of color, but that would include Asian students, American Indian, Native Alaskan, Pacific Islander, all the other groups that are not displayed on the screen. And so what that means that in total is over the course of the past past decade, there have been about 36,000 additional white students that have enrolled in North Carolina charter schools and about 46,000 additional students of color. So we do see, while we don't, again, have specific goals around race, we do see the racial diversity of our schools increasing as well. And so to speak a little bit about the educationally disadvantaged student side of this and what it means for removing barriers for our students within subgrantees as well. This chart is very similar to the first chart that we put up around overall student increase, but this displays the increase in educationally disadvantaged students in our charters or in our subgrantee charter schools specifically. And so what that means is over the last 3 years, we've seen roughly 3,000 additional educationally disadvantaged students enrolled in subgrantee charter schools. And just as a refresher, we consider educationally disadvantaged as students who qualify as economically disadvantaged, English learners, students with disabilities, homeless or unaccompanied youth, and migrant students. And just for, I didn't put the math on this chart, but our cohort 1 schools have enrolled an additional 900 students, educationally disadvantaged students. Our cohort 2 schools have enrolled just about 1,600 additional educationally disadvantaged students, and our cohort 3 schools have enrolled 528 additional educationally disadvantaged students. And so the chart at the bottom of this screen displays that our subgrantees are serving more educationally disadvantaged students than non-subgrantees. And so when we break that down into the specific categories below that, I chose the top 3 just for the sake of the chart, but more economically disadvantaged students than non-subgrantees, 1% less but essentially equal numbers of students with disabilities, and about equal percent or just 1% more of English learners. So you can see that the concentration of educationally disadvantaged students that are enrolled is in the category of students that are qualified for economic disadvantage. And a lot of that is attributable to some of the services that are being provided. Transportation is a requirement of the program. School lunch is a requirement of the program. We also have requirements around intentional marketing and recruitment to reach out to those specific communities. A lot of our schools are translating documents, targeting specific neighborhoods, and really increasing their marketing efforts to reach the communities that are most in need of high-quality school choice options. But another big piece of that is the weighted lottery. And so we have seen a huge expansion of the use of weighted lotteries across the state. Obviously, it is a requirement of our program specifically, but we have also seen other charter schools throughout the state implement weighted lotteries as well. So currently there are, or as of June, there were 64 approved schools across the state that were using weighted lotteries, so about a third of North Carolina charter schools are using weighted lotteries, and we are seeing an uptick in non-subgrantee charter schools applying for weighted lotteries, as well as schools that are coming into the application process now as well. And so while we see this as a positive, it is just one tool in the toolbox, right? The marketing and recruitment is 95% of the work to get the students to apply to the schools, but this tool gives the schools the ability to give statistically higher chances for educationally disadvantaged students to be enrolled. And then I mentioned a little bit about this, but programmatically, some of the requirements of the program, our schools do have 5 years to fully implement the programs that they applied for and were approved for, but we are seeing significant progress along the way in terms of weighted lotteries, implementation of school lunch and transportation. And all of these things, plus additional factors, are things that we monitor programmatically as we monitor each school annually to track their progress along implementation of these required program components. And then I also have Erin Huggins here, and she'll talk a little bit about the Friday Institute's work in helping our program and evaluating our program and the success that subgrantees are having as well in some of these specific areas. We have a little bit of data around academics that I wanted to share. We haven't had a chance to dig into the 21-22 data in detail yet for the publication of this report, so we hope to do that over the course of the next month. But just very briefly, in our initial review of the 2021 data, we do see that there are a significant number of overperformances of subgrantee schools related to the greater charter school landscape and to the state as a whole. And so in math, we see that our subgrantees are outperforming the state. I believe this is compared to the state. Is that to the state? in all categories except the economically disadvantaged category, which they are just 1% below, and the all students category, which they are 3 percentage points below. But outperforming the state in all categories and specific subgroups for English language arts. And so we're excited to dig into the 21-22 data and really see what that means for our subgrantees and what supports we can provide moving forward. But we are seeing promising results. This was sort of the first time that we've been able to dig into the academics because of COVID. And so we're really excited to continue to dig into this piece. And I would love to bring back some additional information in the coming months about the academic progress that our subgrantees are making. The second biggest investment that we make is in growing leaders, and there's a lot of professional development that goes into that. The biggest piece is our Access Fellowship, and so we have a goal of training 160 leaders over the course of 5 years that have been through the Access Fellowship that is specifically designed to support and train leaders on meeting the needs of a diverse student body. And so at the end of last year, we had 144 leaders that we had trained through the first 3 cohorts. The majority of those came from our subgrantee schools. We required 2 leaders from each subgrantee school to go through the fellowship. But we were also able to partner with other leaders and expand that program to include more leaders around the state. So our aspiring minority leaders went through the fellowship as well. I mentioned the Restart leaders. We've had 6 of those at the end of last year, 2 in cohort 2 and 4 in cohort 3. And then we were also able to create a visiting fellows program to invite other charter school leaders that are not subgrantees to send a leader through the year-long fellowship as well. And so we recently just kicked off year 4, which we were super excited about. We were very grateful to have Superintendent Truitt join us for the kickoff in September. And this is just a snapshot of cohort 4. I wanted to include this because it's not specifically included in the report. We didn't have this data when we finished the report. But this year, because we were so close to meeting our goal for 160 and we didn't give out a ton of new subgrants, we opened the fellowship up to all schools across the state. And we got an amazing reception. We currently have 90 fellows that are part of the cohort 4 Access Fellowship. And those represent 73 schools across 33 counties. A lot of them are not subgrantees. They're new to the program, new to the fellowship. We were able to invite some new leaders from subgrantee schools because we have naturally had some turnover over the course of the last couple years. And one of the things that we heard from some of the research that Erin has done is that they wanted access to that development. So schools that have had leadership turnover, we were able to invite those leaders back, even as subgrantees, to be able to participate in this as well. And so what that means more broadly, if you could go to the next slide, please, is that we are on track to not only meet, but very, very much exceed our goal of training 160 leaders. So we are on track to train 220 leaders through the Access Fellowship, and that would cover 126 schools throughout 44 counties across the state. And this year, as I mentioned, we did expand our partnership with the Restart schools, and so we have 12 Restart school leaders that are participating in the fellowship this year. I won't go into detail. I can actually give everyone a full guidebook to our fellowship this year, but this is just a quick year at a glance of some of the speakers that we've lined up. And so we are very excited about some of the development and some of the topics that we're going to talk through this year. And I will actually make a point before I come up for another presentation this afternoon to bring guidebooks if I have some extras for this group as well. So you can see the full breadth of what our leaders are going through this year. And so beyond the fellowship, we do have more investments in development and then also disseminating best practices that our fellows are developing and implementing in their schools. As I mentioned, the Aspiring Minority Leaders Program was something that we were very proud of and very proud of our leaders for completing at the end of the last school year. We are investing in letters training for 200 teachers and 100 leaders across the state. That is something that, while charter schools were not in the legislation to be included in letters training, we were fortunate enough to have some of the financial resources to be able to support that. So we were excited to launch that and provide letters training for a significant number of schools across the state this year. We did launch the Transformative Executive Leadership Cohort, which I mentioned. That is a monthly gathering of about 30 leaders, and they're coached by 2 amazing principals in the state, Alex Quigley of Healthy Start Academy and Jason Jowers of Eno Valley Elementary. And there is some one-on-one coaching and work that goes goes on even within those monthly sessions. So we're excited about that, and we've gotten really positive feedback about that so far. To date, and this number is actually probably out of date by now because we add new best practices daily, weekly on our new website, but there are now at least 67 best practices that have been shared on our website that have been developed and implemented by our subgrantees. We partner with a company, Implement Ed, that helps us work with schools, interview schools, gather the data, and really curate those so they can be downloaded and easily used by anyone throughout the state. They're not just for charter schools. They can be downloaded by any educators or any schools. And then we continue to offer sort of one-off, very, very targeted, specific professional developments and training throughout the year that we're just able to provide free of charge for all charter school staff across the state. And then very briefly, just to touch on the financials, what you'll see on the top chart is the full program expenditures to date, and that includes our internal program expenditures as well as reimbursed expenditures for schools. It's just over $8 million at this point, and that is behind what we would have expected at this point. A large chunk of that comes from some of the challenges of the pandemic. Obviously, schools were in difficult positions with just operations and some of the things that they had to deal with during that time, but also the influx of ESSER funds and CARES funding that really had to be spent down in a lot of times more quickly than our funds. That in many ways took precedence over spending the access funds, but we do expect this to rebound and grow pretty exponentially over the course of the next couple of years. But as I mentioned, even though our state award ends at the end of September of 2023 next year, our subgrantees have 5 years to expend their funds. And so, again, I will address this at the end, but we plan to apply for a no-cost extension, which is a very common practice of the CSP program, to continue our services and monitoring and support of all of our schools, even though our official grant period would end at the end of next year. And then the chart at the bottom is just a very brief distribution of the amount of funding that has been awarded over the course of our 4 competitive cycles to the 62 charter schools that I mentioned. So what I would like to do now is to turn it over to Erin Huggins. She is the chief researcher that we work with at the Friday Institute, to just talk very briefly about their program evaluation, how they've supported us, what they've found, and some of the ways that they found that we can improve our services of the program.
Thank you all so much for having me. As Jay said, I'm Erin Huggins from the Friday Institute. A lot of the research that we have done over the past 2 years has already been shared, so I will try to keep this brief. But our program evaluation looked at largely the implementation and the impact of the NC Access program, as well as providing suggestions for program improvements in a formative manner. Specifically, we wanted to examine how many charter schools were now supporting educationally disadvantaged students, and within those schools, what proportion of increase we had seen in their enrollment of educationally disadvantaged students. In addition to that, we wanted to examine the ways in which these schools were removing barriers for their students and closing academic proficiency gaps. And then within the Fellows program, we also wanted to examine how participation in that year-long program increased school leaders' confidence in their ability to support educationally disadvantaged students and their ability to be able to share those best practices more broadly with other school leaders across the state. So as stated earlier, the NC Access program has already met its goal of enrolling 60 schools into the NC Access program. When we looked at all of the applicants that applied for this funding, we found that almost all of them had met the threshold score of 80 out of 100 points on their rubric that they were scored on. If we're looking specifically at this year's enrollments, we see that only 16% of the NC Access schools actually met their enrollment targets that were laid out within their applications, and 31% of schools met their enrollment targets for educationally disadvantaged students specifically. I will say COVID-19 was probably the largest reason schools noted for not being able to reach those targets. I think across the state that has been a challenge. And we will, it also should be noted that cohort 3 schools had already conducted their open enrollments before they knew that they would be participating in the NC Access program this year. So I say that because we are going to be looking at these numbers very closely in the coming year, starting in October, and providing formative feedback to the program with regards to student enrollment and other areas in order to identify schools that may need additional supports. In addition to just looking at the school's targets for enrollment, we also examined the number of schools that had enrolled over 50% educationally disadvantaged students, and we found that 35% of those schools had already done that, and 20% were close to reaching that target. Let me go to the next slide. So each of these schools, as Jay mentioned earlier, had to submit plans for removing barriers for the educationally disadvantaged student populations that they were serving. Specifically, the weighted lottery transportation plans and school lunch plans were deemed the most important for removing those barriers. And we looked at total submissions. We did a content analysis to examine the comprehensiveness of those program plans, and then worked with schools to identify how many were fully implementing those plans within their school. And so this was a pretty comprehensive year-long process. While we did find not all of the schools had provided very comprehensive plans, the NC Access program did work with the schools throughout the year last year to review all of these different programs and plans, and to make sure that they were being implemented in a very comprehensive manner. We also were hoping to be able to examine the maintenance of high quality status among the charter schools this year. Those data have not been available for the past few years, but we do hope to be able to report that to you next year. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we've already looked at the performance ratings for the schools. Originally, what we wanted to do was to be able to compare average performance of students across schools and compare them year to year. However, we didn't have prior data to be able to do that. So what we did was we compared the average NC Access school proficiency levels to that of the state. And as mentioned earlier, they were for the NC Access schools, they were slightly lower in mathematics, but we did see quite a big difference positively in language arts for both educationally disadvantaged and total student populations. And then finally, we wanted to see what the impact of participating in the NC Access Fellows program had on school leaders across the state. And we found that 95% of leaders that participated in the Fellows program felt more confident about supporting students at their schools. 89% of the schools have already shared best practices in one or more ways, including professional development for their teachers, sharing at conferences, or sharing information and resources directly with other schools. The NC Access program has more than met its goal of increasing the number of best practices that are publicly available on their website. And while the overall traffic on their website was slightly down this year, we did see a 10% increase in unique viewers that were accessing the resources page on the NC Access website. And all of this will continue to monitor formatively throughout the year and provide suggestions for program improvement. And while the program is making strides towards meeting all of its performance goals, there were several challenges to implementation, and staffing probably being the largest one. Not only has it been challenging for schools to hire and retain highly qualified teachers, but it's also very difficult to find other staff members, including bus drivers. And we all know that that's not something unique to this program. This is something we're seeing as a need across the state. Additionally, we found that the schools also requested additional wraparound services in order to better support their students. This includes mental health supports, which were a great need last year, as well as things such as before and after school programs and additional tutoring programs. And some of the schools have been very creative in how they've been able to use their funds to be able to support some of these programs. However, other schools have mentioned that there is limited funding and that while they would like to be able to implement these types of programs, they just don't have the resources to do so. Also, as we're entering into the final years of the grant program, schools are also starting to think about how they're going to be able to sustain these efforts once all of this funding has run out. And then just in general, as Jay mentioned earlier, schools were having difficulty, especially last year when we were all remote with COVID, with their marketing and outreach efforts. And that's something that the program's really working on helping the schools with this year. And then finally, we provided several suggestions for program improvement. A lot of the fellows mentioned that they would love to have better ways of networking with other school leaders. And that largely was a challenge related to COVID and us having to provide the fellowship meetings virtually for 2 years. Now that the fellowships are back in person, we feel like this will kind of naturally fix itself and provide those opportunities to network in person, but thinking also as to ways to share best practices virtually. The fellows have also requested that a best practice repository be created. This could be something as simple as a Google Drive folder where the school leaders can share best practices, or some kind of communication platform such as Slack or Discord where leaders can ask questions and get real-time feedback. And while most of the fellows were very excited about being back in person this year, some, especially leaders in the far reaches of the state, were concerned about having to drive so far to attend in person each month. And so we recommended that a hybrid offering be available for those leaders that can't necessarily attend every single month. Also, as Jay has mentioned, several leadership changes have happened within the schools, and so they are now going to be providing an opportunity for anyone who wants to attend the fellowships to attend. And then to wrap it all up, a couple of other things that were mentioned were just suggestions for getting a little bit more advice on how to best utilize their funding. And other leaders mentioned that some of the presentations throughout the past year appeared to be geared more towards a teacher audience, and they would like to see a more targeted focus on how to support leadership in supporting educationally disadvantaged students. And that is pretty much wraps up our evaluation in a nutshell. Our full evaluation report is available online on the NC Access website, and I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any.
Thank you very much for the presentation, both of you. Mr. Whalen, I do know that during the pre-committee meeting that we talked about the federal monitoring of this grant, and would you like to just make a comment or a statement about the state's execution of oversight for these funds and how they're used, and the reimbursement process as it stands? Just give us an update on how that's where we stand with that.
Yeah, so we continue to work really closely with the U.S. Department of Ed to make sure that we are complying with all program requirements, that all the funds are being used allowably, in addition to annual performance reporting and all the other requirements that we have of the program that we've had for years. We continue to submit all the necessary documentation and work closely with them to make sure that they have confidence that we're implementing the program with fidelity, that we're seeing results. All of our reports, all of our progress monitoring, all of that stuff is shared with the department on a regular basis. And so we're in constant communication with them to make sure that they have confidence in the oversight that we're doing. We should be getting our scheduled monitoring report back from West Ed in the coming weeks, so that will give us additional information on how we can better improve our practices. And we've been told that there's nothing significant that's coming in that, but that will help us just get better at our services and what we're being able to provide to our schools.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, do you have questions about this report?
I do have a question.
Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Ms. White, and thank you so much for this fine report. I always kind of pivot to anything that has the word leadership in it. And so I would love to know more about the curriculum. The students who are in the leadership training, they're getting their MSAs or their add-ons, whichever. I'd like to know more about the curriculum, their program of study, because in my mind, it seems like it's tailor-made for working in at-risk community, or school communities, or disadvantaged areas, or struggling schools, or low-performing students. Is that correct?
So the curriculum itself at Appalachian State is not necessarily geared towards that. We partnered with Appalachian State to basically pay for these leaders to go through the add-on licensure program. So there is a set curriculum that Appalachian State has that they matriculated through. We did work with them pretty specifically to add some charter-specific context to some of those courses. And so knowing that all of our leaders came from charter schools, there was portions of the curriculum in some of the courses that added some of the context around what the flexibilities that charter schools have and how to work within those environments. That program was not specifically designed the way the Access Fellowship was toward serving educationally disadvantaged students, if that makes sense.
Well, I just think there's so much application that we can learn lessons from this initiative that could apply across the state in other settings that have similar challenges. I'll just talk with you offline because I'm very interested in knowing even some of the strategies that you provided the Appalachian State with professors and others.
Yeah, and they were a great resource. We were super proud to and grateful to partner with them, and that was sort of the reason we also had those leaders go through the Access Fellowship as well, to sort of get both sides of not only the principal preparation and the leadership preparation through Appalachian State, but some of the other support that we could provide from the fellowship towards the supporting educationally and diverse students.
That would be great to know more about that. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Oxenide. Board members, I'm getting the nod from the chair that our time is quickly escaping us. Ms. Huggins, thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of the Friday Institute and for the work that you've done to provide additional insight into the execution of this program. Mr. Chair, that concludes our work on this committee today.
Thank you, Ms. White. And for our final discussion before lunch is the Healthy Responsible Students, and I'll turn to Mr. Reginald Keenan. Mr. Keenan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Reginald Keenan along with Alden Duncan. We've come before you, Mr. Chair, with one action item. And of course, back in March, we adopted the temporary rule for scholastic athletics and the municipal organization for high school athletics. Today, we bring proposed permanent rule, and I think Tom's like, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you have the B team here today, and in place of Tom Zyko, you have Brandon Walker, agency legal consultant for the state board. And as Mr. Keenan stated, we're here to request approval for beginning the permanent rule process for our interscholastic athletics and administering organizations for high school athletics rule. It's a mouthful, 16 NCAC 06E.0204. As everybody recalls, back in March, the board approved the temporary rule, which is now currently on the books and in operation. So as the first step of beginning the permanent rule process, we're requesting board approval. And what that does is essentially take all the work that we did for the temporary rule and move that over to the permanent rule process, where we essentially start the process over again. A lot of fun, but a lot of the legwork's already been done. The temporary rule has been approved. The only change that we're going to see in the permanent rule is if you look at page 3 of the temporary rule, you'll see in highlight the bottom of M1, where we add language regarding the American and Disabilities Act. Now, this is something that's in place today. It doesn't change the meaning of the rule, but just feedback that we received from stakeholders involved in the rule that they thought it was important to just remind people of the obligation under the American and Disabilities Act. So we've included that language as a reminder. That's the only change that we have from what's been approved as a temporary rule. We're going to continue to monitor and work with any technical changes with OAH or some of the formatting changes that you see, which is not a major deal. So with that, I think the important thing is just to highlight for everybody our timetable that we're working with. The temporary rule is approved. That's good through April 11th, 2023. That's an important date because after April 11th, if we don't have a permanent rule in place, the temporary rule expires. And then we have to start this whole process over again. So with that said, today's our first step. And if the board chooses to approve the rule, then we'll move next week and our staff will file it with OAH, file the rule with OAH. And then from there, November 16th, we'll hold a public hearing. The public comment period should end on January 3rd, 2023. Then we'll come back for the board for final approval in the January meeting. That's January 4th. If everything looks good to the board, we'll move that over to the Rules Review Commission by the end of January, January 20th. And that will be reviewed at the Rules Review Commission meeting on February 16th. And if we make it through that process without any objections, then we'll have our permanent rule on the books by March 1st, a month before our April deadline. So that gives us a little bit of wiggle room there. So not to take up any more of your time, I'll open it up for questions.
Questions, comments, final one? If not, Mr. Chair, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Thank you, Mr. Keenan. That concludes our work for this morning. We're going to break for lunch, but colleagues, you can join me in the lounge immediately. We have a photo opportunity, and then we'll break for lunch. We'll return at 1:30 p.m. 1:30. Let's try to make it sound better.